medieval English gardens, there was no differentiation between plants at all. Flowers, fruit, herbs and vegetables were all just plants, so they were all grown together in the same garden. And it wasn't until the Victorians that vegetables were suddenly considered vulgar and were banished behind high walls out of sight of sensitive Victorian ladies. Though, of course, the real cottagers continued to grow their flowers and their fruit and their vegetables all together. Well, today, with our small gardens, we're of course the modern day cottagers, and I think that we should follow their example too. And once you get out of your head the idea that vegetables are ugly, then you can create some really interesting effects. I think, for example, that this sweet corn, underplanted with marigolds and lobelia, look really attractive. And how about this? If somebody offered you this as a purely ornamental plant, I'm sure you'd jump at it, especially if they told you it came from China. Big, bold, dramatic foliage and a succession of yellow fruits right the way through the season. Well, of course, it's the courgette variety Gold Rush, and that will give you marrows and courgettes to eat right through the summer. And if you saw in the nurseryman's catalogue a shrub that would provide you with pink and white flowers in profusion in the spring, followed by fruits as big as your fist, then I'm sure you'd jump at it. But of course, you can eat apples too. There are plenty of ornamental strawberries offered in garden centres these days, but the real thing is just as attractive, especially if you grow it in association with flowers like these impatiens. And of course, the aristocrat of them all, the globe artichoke, is often offered as a purely ornamental plant. But of course, you can eat those flower buds as well, and delicious they are too. And doesn't it look good in association with those blue salvias and the nicotiana? For fresh, attractive foliage, I don't think you can beat beetroot. And doesn't it go well with the orange of these marigolds and the red and pink of the fuchsia? And contrast too in shape and colour with the spiky foliage of these onions behind. Squashes are always interesting and beautiful in the garden, and for dramatic foliage, how about this Swiss chard? And bear in mind that all these were grown with natural manures and fertilisers. Early on in the season, of course, there's no need to put extra compost or manure on the soil because that was done in the winter. But always, before sowing or planting, it's a good idea to put just a little dusting of bloodfish and bone meal on, just to add a little bit of a boost. And then you can work up a fine tilth just with the back of the fork. That's all it needs. Now we're going to sow this one in a patch, so let's just mark out the patch first so we know where we're going. And then the best way to make the drills is just with a piece of stick like this. Just mark out some, scratch out little rows like that. You could actually broadcast seed in these circles, but this is a much better way because if weeds come up, you can tell them from the plants because, of course, the plants are the ones in the straight lines. Now, I'm sowing an early carrot variety here called Early Nantes. Just sprinkle very, very thinly down the rows. Sow all the drills first and then cover them by just brushing a little soil over them with your hand. Firm them in by patting them down and then put a few canes in around the patch to remind you where you've sown, just until the seedlings come through. And of course, don't forget the label. It's really much the same story with flowers too. Just a little sprinkle of bloodfish and bone meal. Just work that into the top with a fork. I want to grow some flowers here because I'm more or less surrounded by vegetables in this part of the garden. I've got a little patch of cabbages over there. Some peas which are coming on, they'll need supporting with pea sticks very shortly, and a little clump of onions here as well. Now all those really need disguising to try and confuse the pests, and so I'm going to do that with some little hardy annual plants. This is violet cress, and it's a superb little violet mound of flowers on a plant only about 3 inches tall. Because these seedlings were raised in the greenhouse. And on a cold day in early spring, you're going to be mighty glad you got a greenhouse, I can tell you. At first sight, it may seem like a bit of an extravagance, but in fact, in a garden like this, a greenhouse really is essential. First of all, it'll extend the season and the scope of your gardening quite considerably, and that means that you're going to enjoy your garden more, and of course that's important. But perhaps even more important is the fact that you can raise many of the plants that you're going to need outside in the garden, in the greenhouse, at a fraction of the cost of buying them, and that means that eventually the greenhouse is going to pay for itself. And if you choose the right sort of design, it will actually enhance the appearance of the garden. And of course, in this garden, that's the name of the game. Oh, it's nice and warm in here. And if you really want to extend the season in the greenhouse, then you know it's well worthwhile heating it, and it won't cost you a vast amount of money. I use a little electric fan heater, or if you haven't got electricity in the greenhouse, then you could use paraffin or gas. But it's well worthwhile because it enables you to start early in the season. Now, I start very early with particularly vegetables and things that are going to go out under cloches and give me the earliest cropping. Things like lettuces, cabbages, cauliflowers, that sort of thing. I sow them in pots because you don't need a vast amount, and I use a multi-purpose compost. Don't compress it too much, and then just push it down with another pot like that to give a nice even surface. And then don't forget, most important, always water before you sow. Give it a really good soaking like that, and then let it drain away a bit. I'm going to use a lettuce here called Little Gem. It's a good early variety, nice little cos lettuce. Now, you don't need very many, sow quite thinly. You don't want to be feeding the world, and you'll see that if you put them in your hand like that and just tap it, they just run down that little groove, and you can sow them quite thinly. That's plenty there. Now, they want to be covered, but you must never cover too much. That's the biggest reason of failure of seeds. So just a little bit of compost in a sieve and just cover it so you can just not see them. That's perfect. Now, you want to try and retain the moisture in there, stop it drying out. So cover them up with just a little square of black polythene will be fine, and then put them in a propagator. Now, a propagator really is invaluable, you know, in the greenhouse. It's like a little mini greenhouse, really. It's electrically heated, and it will provide the right temperature for germination without actually having to heat the whole greenhouse. So that's very useful, saves a lot of money. If you haven't got electricity in the greenhouse, then you can stick that on the windowsill, or alternatively, you can germinate things in the airing cupboard. Now, once those have actually germinated, and you've got little seedlings like this, they come out, of course, into the light, and then they need to be divided from that pot and spread out quite a lot more, otherwise they're all competing with each other. And you use here a little stick like that, and handle always by the leaves, never by the stem, because you'll damage the plant if you do. Very, very carefully. And then just make a hole in the compost. Again, I'm using multi-purpose. Hop the roots down into the bottom very carefully, and then firm by putting the stick in at the side so you can get right down at the bottom like that. And in she goes. And then you'll space them out so they've got quite a lot more room to grow. like that. Put those in a nice light place now, and away they'll go. Now, an alternative way of sowing is one that I use quite a lot actually here, and I'm going to sow some onions this way. Now, these are little polystyrene blocks divided up into cells. You can buy these in the garden centre, and I think they're absolutely invaluable. Again, fill them up with multi-purpose compost, and with these you buy a little presser board like this full of pegs, and just press down that compost a little. Again, not too hard, but I can't say this often enough, don't forget to water before you sow, always before, never afterwards. Right, now I'm going to sow these onions in a particular way. This is a variety called Brunswick, incidentally, which is a red one and looks very attractive in the ornamental kitchen garden. You want to go for these attractive vegetables because they're good to look at and very good to eat. Now, what I'm doing here is a technique called multiple sowing. In each one of these little cells, I'm going to put about 6 to 8 seeds. You don't have to count them. You don't have to be that accurate. Something like 6 to 8. Now go in there like that. I won't complete the whole thing now, but when you have done it, you then just stabilise those with a little bit of silver sand. Again, this is something that you can get in the garden centre. That'll just hold the seedlings in and stop them pushing themselves out when they root. And when you finish the whole lot, these won't want a lot of heat. You don't want to give onions too much heat, but just cover them up so that you keep the light out and keep them nice and moist, and put them on the greenhouse benching. Now, eventually they'll grow into something like that. Now, you can see that these are growing up in clumps. Now, you don't thin those out at all. You simply plant them out exactly as they are, and you'll see underneath that these blocks have holes right the way through, and so the presser board will push them out. You've got a little block and you plant it out as a block. Ideal for this method because they can go in amongst the flowers and they look really good. And they will eventually push each other out of the way and produce perfect kitchen-sized little onions in a little block. I use that technique for all sorts of other things as well, like beetroot and carrots too. Now, the other thing that I want to use the greenhouse for is taking cuttings, because you can save yourself a tremendous amount of money at this time of the year taking cuttings. Things like chrysanthemums, geraniums and fuchsias like this are ideal subjects. And this is what you do. It really is very easy and it's great fun too. Just take the cutting anywhere like that. You need a sharp knife for this, and then just trim it up, taking off the bottom leaves. You don't want, with cuttings, for them to lose too much moisture. So you need to take the leaves off, and I would leave that about like that. Actually, there's a little bit too much there, leaf, so what I'm going to do is just cut those top ones in half. It won't do it any harm, but it won't lose too much water. And then you just trim it below a leaf joint, like that, again with a sharp knife, and then put it into the compost. Now, this compost is a bit different. This one consists of 50-50 coconut fibre compost and vermiculite. That's the whitish stuff that you can see on the top there. It lightens up the compost and allows a little bit more air in, and that's the sort of thing that cuttings require. You can buy vermiculite in the garden centre, and then you simply dibble those into the compost right up to the leaves, firm them in so they're not hanging in mid-air. Again, I've watered before I put those in, and then these can go into the propagator, and it won't take very long at all before they root. Now, all those things I do fairly early on in the spring, and later on you can still use the greenhouse, and one of the things that I'll be using it for a little bit later is to start off one or two things in pots. Things like tomatoes, for example, and these. These are one of my great favourites. They're vegetable spaghetti, actually, but all sorts of marrows and squashes you can grow. Now, vegetable spaghetti is a super thing, but it has one great disadvantage in a small garden, and that is that it's a trailing variety, so it takes up an enormous amount of room, but not the way I grow it. And by the end of the summer, you can really see what I mean. These are the vegetable spaghetti, and here's a quite respectable marrow. The fruit, indeed, is so heavy that it needs to be supported by these strings, but both of these will keep until Christmas, and they seem to get tastier and tastier the longer that you keep them. But just imagine how much space this big plant would take up on the ground in a small garden. Almost impossible to grow. But up the pergola, they take up next to no space and make a very attractive feature too. There are all sorts of other things you can grow as well. How about growing your runner beans up the pergola? This is a variety called Painted Lady, and the red and white flowers make it look very attractive too, and the beans are very high quality. And of course, I also wouldn't be without purely ornamental plants. Certainly I would want to grow roses on my pergola. And the grapevine is another good one too. This one has attractive foliage in the summer, and of course you'll get grapes out of it that you can make wine from later on, and in the autumn the foliage turns a beautiful rich bronze colour. Now, the pergola itself is not difficult to make, and we'll show you how to do that later on in the series. But first of all, underneath it there has to be a path, and instead of making another scree path, this time we've chosen to do it in brick. But these are no ordinary bricks. House bricks are made for building walls, and if you use those for a path, then on the first frost they're going to flake. So you must get special engineering blue bricks or these special pavias, and you can buy these at the garden centre or the builders merchants. Now, they're laid on ordinary sharp sand, which again you can buy at the builders merchants, but that has to be contained, so you need to put down a wooden edging. But the first thing to do is to make sure that you've got the width of the path right. So first of all, just loosely lay out the bricks in the pattern that you want to put them, and leave a little space in between them. There's no need to be too accurate. This is about 1/4 of an inch, but that space is going to vary when you come to the curves in the path anyway. But make them reasonably even, and then just cut a piece of wood to make sure it's the right size. This one happens to be 34 inches, and then that piece of wood can be used right the way through to measure the width of your path. The edging's fixed to wooden pegs in exactly the same way we did it for the scree path, but there is one small difference here. In my design, I've curved the path, so in order to get the wood to bend more easily, I've cut a series of saw cuts about 1.5 inches apart and 3/4 of the way through the wood. The tighter the bend, then the closer the saw cuts need to be, and make sure that they come on the inside of the bend. And then you just fix the edging on as we did it before for the scree path. Now we come to the tricky bit, so you've got to wish me luck here. This is where the bend comes in. So just put the bit of edging again on there, and then gently pull the wood round. Again, bang it in. Then you would simply check that for level again, in exactly the same way, and nail it on. You need to dig out about 6 inches below the top of the edging boards, and that's to accommodate, first of all, the base, which is 2 inches of ballast and cement at a ratio of 6:1, and this is put on dry in exactly the same way that we did it for the base of the paving. And then you need 2 inches of sharp sand on the top of that. Tip that in and just rake it out. When you put this sand down, make sure that it's damp. We've got a dampish day today, so this is okay, but if it's dry, then wet it with a watering can or a hose first of all. Then when you've raked it out roughly, then go over the whole thing, treading it down firm with your heels. Right, now having got it nice and compacted, you now want to get the top of the sand exactly 2 inches below the top of the edging board in order to accommodate the bricks. And to do this, I've made up a little scraper board here. It's just a piece of 3x1 timber, but I've cut a 2-inch step in it, a 2-inch drop there, so that this can be used to scrape back the sand. And I know then it's exactly 2 inches. If you find, as I have here, you've got a little hole here and there, just put a bit of sand in and go over it again. Once you've levelled a couple of yards of sand, you can then start laying the bricks, and these are just placed out in the pattern that you've selected, just on the top of the sand like this. Making sure that you've got the space in between. There's no real need to do this, I suppose, but I just like to just tap them down with a club hammer just to make sure that they're in the right position and they're not going to move. And you want to do a couple of rows, but note that this one is a slightly different pattern. And this just makes it a little bit more interesting. Right, now we want to work some sand in between those joints. So just a little bit of sand on there and then brush it in. Now the bricks need to be bashed down to make them rock solid, and to do this you need a fairly hefty chunk of wood just laid across there, and I bash them down with a fencing post, but I always put my gloves on first because I can assure you there's no better way of getting splinters than doing this. Bang those down. And you can see that they're going down to just the level of the edging boards. Now the rest of the path is laid, of course, in exactly the same way until you get to the base for the pergola. Now that is done in a slightly different way because, of course, this is octagonal. You can have it any size at all that you like, and the first thing to do is to find the centre of it and put a cane in. Now I've made mine 8 foot in diameter, so cut yourself a 4 foot long piece of string, slip it over the cane and mark a circle. And then all you've got to do is to cut 8 pieces of wood to make the octagon. If you have an 8 foot circle, those pieces of wood have got to be 3 foot long, so that's quite convenient. Now you put the sand in, consolidate it, level it in exactly the same way, except of course that you've got to cut yourself a longer piece of wood, and then you can start laying your bricks. And you lay these in segments, and that will look really very attractive. So start off by marking out the segments. Obviously there are 8 of these in all. Then lay the bricks just as you would really, I suppose, a brick wall. Just lay them straight out like that. And at the edges you're going to have to do a bit of cutting. So you slip it under the string like that and just mark it out with a brick bolster where you've got to cut. And it should, keep your fingers crossed, come off reasonably cleanly. Clean as a whistle. And then that goes in there. You do exactly the same thing for the other side, of course, and then just continue, but the next row will go like that, just to form a bond, exactly like brickwork. And you carry on in exactly the same way, just like that, until you reach the middle. And when each section is completed like that, it's easy to see why you need to taper in towards the centre. But of course, when you get to the middle, you've got to think about doing something a little bit different to finish it off. So I'm using an idea that I saw in a Victorian garden in Somerset. And you start off by setting a flower pot in the middle. And keep putting in smaller ones, setting them in sand to keep the tops level, until you get to the smallest one in the middle. That has to have its top cut off, which is a bit fiddly, but quite possible using a hacksaw. So with the pergola base and the path finished, I think they look perhaps a little bit hard at the moment, but eventually it's going to look rather nice. A year later, the path's beginning to look quite nice, but the edges still look a little bit hard, so I'm softening those by planting some lobelia here in amongst the lettuces, and they'll tumble over the edges and take away that hard outline. On the scree path, it's a bit different, because here, of course, we've got alpines actually growing in the path, and the last thing we want is for plants from the borders to flop over those and obscure their sunlight. So here I'm growing step-over apples, and these are really just single-tier espaliers. You've got the main stem coming up here, and then you just train a single shoot either side of that main stem, about 9 inches above the ground, and just look at the fruit it's got on there in only its second year. By the end of the summer, as you can see, the plants have made tremendous growth. But because of that, alas, we've lost some of that fruit. But that's perfectly normal with a tree which is only 2 years old. By the time these step-over apples are about 4 years old, they really do produce a very respectable crop in a small space. And I don't know about you, but I think they look very attractive too. And of course, it's those three things that are exactly what we're trying to achieve in the ornamental kitchen garden.
Next week at the same time, Jeff Hamilton visits the Elizabethan knot garden at Hatfield House.
Lilies have been cultivated for over 3,000 years, but the majority of these exquisite blossoms have only become generally available over recent decades. They're still relatively expensive to buy, so John Main has a few good tips on how to make the most of your precious lily plants.
The propagation of any plant material in the garden is always a fascinating thing for us to have to do, and with the lilium in particular, there are a number of ways in which we can go about the job. So what we've got to do is to allow these pods to ripen off on the plant, and immediately they start to go brownish and split on the top. Then is the time to take the seed off the plant, hang it up in a bag and keep it during the winter in a cool, sort of airy spot in the house, and then in February or thereabouts we'll then start to sow the seed, because I think if you sow it at this period of the year, you'll find that the seedlings will probably begin to grow, but by the time winter comes along, they'll very quickly then begin to die off. But there are other ways in which we can go about the job, and Lilium in tigrinum in particular does fortunately for us, produce these small bulbils on the stem. And at this time of the year, all one basically has to do is to remove these from the stem of the plant. But as you can see, they're quite small and they could obviously rot off and die off in the winter. So what I want to do is to use a fungicide, a good ordinary garden fungicide, and really coat these small bulbils with the fungicide. You can then remove the bulbils from the fungicide, and then in a bag you could put some moist peat in the bottom of it. The peat doesn't want to be too wet, it just wants to be nice and moist. You can then place these bulbils in the bag, shake them up in the bag so that they're in contact with the moisture in the peat. You could then seal the bag, making 1 or 2 extra holes around the top of the bag, because obviously we don't want the moisture and that to rot the bulbs off. So you could then make 1 or 2 extra holes just in the top of the bag and then hang it up in the shed somewhere in the cool, but really away from the worst of the frost from the winter. And as you get these bulbils on the stem, with 1 or 2 of them, you also get these very small bulbils forming actually on the stems of the plant again, but this time underneath the soil, and these can be removed in exactly the same way. The other method which we can use to increase the liliums, and at this time of the year one can go out into the shops and buy the bulbs, is to remove a few of the scales from the plant. Remember, when you're removing the scales, particularly don't use any of these damaged scales, anything that's had disease or pests near it. Remove these scales from the plant to begin with. And there's probably about 100 and 150 scales on the plant. This is the sort of material we want, which is nice and clean, as you can see, and just gently break them away from the plant, and you'll find that in time small bulbils will then form on the inside of the base of the scale. So remove as many as you want. You'll probably find that liliums can be quite expensive for us to buy. We can probably only afford to buy 1 of them, but there's no reason before planting the bulb in the garden why you can't remove a few of the scales, and again put them in the fungicide. Just give it a shake up so that the fungicide will protect them for the winter months. You can then take them out, and then again you can either use the peat, which is moistened, or you can use vermiculite or perlite, things like that. And again, just put your scales in there, shake it up so that they come in contact with the vermiculite, tie the bag and put some holes again in the top, and this bag could go into somewhere warm in the house, and after about 6 or 7 weeks or so you'll find that the bulbils will then start to form on the base of the scales. It doesn't matter if you store the scales in the bag in the dark, but once the bulbils have formed on there, we will then take the propagation scale on again, and we will then pot them up individually and grow them on in a cold frame or something like that to plant out in the garden. You've got to remember, with scales and seed and bulbils in particular, it's probably going to take us 2 or 3 years or so to be able to build up the size of the bulb again, to be able to get the flowers on the plant. So it's quite a long sort of a term thing for us to do. Fortunately, with some of the liliums, and liliums like Lilium pardalinum in particular, one can basically divide the lily bulbs up, and this is obviously a far quicker thing for us to do, and we'll obviously get the flowers far quicker. And as it's coming up to the time of the year, within a month or so, when one should be lifting and dividing and planting them, all one has basically got to do is to hold them in the hand and just gently ease them apart, and you'll see that they split off fairly easily. You could then dust the surface there with fungicide and then plant those back in the garden, and hopefully that will then increase the number of plants which you've got and be a relatively inexpensive and quite an interesting sort of exercise for you to do with them.
The rock garden plants flowered in early summer in the dry stone wall. There's a nice depth of soil on the top of the wall where conditions are suitable for plants that give colour earlier in the year. David Mulford is about to put them in.
Now we're looking forward to spring, and here we need colour as well. So what can we grow in the top of this wall for spring? well, bulbs of course, but not the massive great bulbs, the narcissus and big tulips, but the dwarfer ones. Some of the dwarf ones, such as the Narcissus asturiensis, little thing like this, it needs warmth and it needs perfect drainage. And here we can supply that kind of condition. So I have 10 of these little daffodils, lovely little things. I'll plant those, 10 in a group. Because these bulbs are small, there's no reason why you shouldn't plant them with the same rule as you plant other bulbs. That is roughly about once or twice its depth. You notice I plant them in clumps. With these dwarf ones, it's rather silly to have just one, so we plant them in tens and have a lovely, bold little group. Let's now turn to iris. And there are two ones you can really put in, the reticulated ones. This is Iris reticulator, a purpley colour, grows about that high. Again, I've got 10 of them, lovely little bulbs, and I'll plant these here. And we'll follow on this wall, planting all the way along.
Iris stanfordii flowers even earlier than Iris reticulata. You can expect blossoms in February.
There's all sorts of things. There's crocus, snowdrops, muscari, all masses of them, anemones. One special one I like, I think I'll end on, tulip. A massive bulb, I agree, but a flower about 6 to 9 inches, not much taller. It's called Red Riding Hood, a pretty little thing, as the colour says, but also the leaves are beautiful. They're spotted, and you get the benefit of both worlds. It really is a charmer.
Dave's been planting bulbs outside, that's dwarf bulbs for flowering in the spring. I'm going to plant some bulbs in bowls now that you can grow indoors. These are Roman hyacinths, and hopefully we can force them for Christmas. Using an ordinary bulb bowl, just use fibre for growing the bulbs in, fibre that you can obtain from any sundriesman, placing the bulbs quite evenly into the bowl like that. Make sure you use plenty of bulbs in the bowl so that you get a good display. Roman hyacinths, incidentally, differ a little bit from the ordinary hyacinth insofar that they have lots of small flower spokes, but they're very pleasant. We're using prepared bulbs, by the way. These have been specially prepared by the bulb grower so that they will force easily. It's very essential that when you buy your prepared bulbs, to plant them in your bowls straight away. Don't hang on to them, else you can have trouble forcing them into flower. There we are then. We shall soak the fibre. Ideally, place the bowl into a cellar or an airy cupboard in the dark and inspect them about once a week. Once they start to grow, 8 to 12 weeks possibly, then remove them from the cellar or the cupboard and just lightly shade them so that they start to green up slowly. This is important.
Besides Roman hyacinths, the bulbs of paper white narcissus planted now will give a good display in time for Christmas. We planted freesia corms last month, but you can try them from seed as well.
Freesia probably better sown earlier in the year, May, June perhaps, but I'm assured by my friends in the seed trade that we should get quite a good germination at this time of the year and hopefully have flowers in, say, March, April next year. Freesia seed sown, we just soak the surface to make sure that we've got the whole of the compost dampened, placed into the greenhouse for germination.
And later, a fine spring flower. As summer's fruits come to an end, now is the perfect time to start planning a fruit garden. But think carefully about which forms of fruit plants will be most suitable. Here's Harry Baker with some suggestions.
Now I'm standing against perhaps one of the best forms for the small garden, a restricted form called the cordon, the oblique cordon. Now the oblique cordon applies to apples and pears, not to the stone fruits. The oblique cordon, planted at an angle of 45, a single stem plant, grown to a height of 6 or 7 feet. Closely spaced, which means you can get lots of varieties in a small area. You can get earlies, mids and lates. And of course, you can cover this requirement of cross-pollination. Apples and pears are not self-fertile. Now, the yield from an apple or pear cordon is about 4 or 5 pounds of fruit. You can do better than that, but that's a good average. Apple and pear cordons can be grown against a west, east, or even a south-facing fence, but not against the north fence. It's too cold. Now, having looked at the cordon, let's have a look at another restricted form, the espalier. The espalier has horizontal arms outstretched. This particular espalier is a 4-tiered one. Now, the beauty of the espalier is that it can be grown against a low fence. For example, if it was a 2-tier or a 3-tier espalier, you could grow it against a 4 or 5 foot fence, whereas the cordon needed more height than that. Now, the yield from a well-grown 3-tier espalier apple or pear is about 15 to 20 pounds of fruit, and the aspect is the same as for the cordon apple and pear. But there's one other form, remember, suitable for growing against fences and on wires, and that's the fan.
In the south, you can train peach trees to grow this way, but it should always be against a south-facing wall or fence. The black Morello cherry is much hardier and can grow happily on north-facing fences all over the country. If you've enough space, orchard trees are fine, but you might well need something smaller.
This is the dwarf bush apple tree, again grafted on a dwarfing rootstock. This will give you about 40 pounds of fruit. The spindle bush about the same, and the plum pyramid, that'll give you about 25 pounds of fruit. So trees out in the open will give you more fruit, but of course they need more space. And here we have the typical soft fruit plot. The gooseberry bush, the open-centered gooseberry bush, spaced about 4 feet apart. The open-centered red currant or white currant bush, 5 feet apart. And the big black currant bush, spaced 6 feet apart. This is where there's plenty of room. And finally, a row of raspberries. This is probably the best way of growing raspberries on a single wire fence. They don't need as much room. You can grow raspberries on parallel wires, but it needs more space. This is the best way, I think. Nicely presented to the sun, nicely ripened canes. And now we come to another lovely form for the small garden. I'm very fond of these. These are the vertical gooseberry cordons. Closely spaced, 12 inches apart, so you can get lots of varieties in a small area. Easy to train, easy to pick, easy to spray, and easy to net against the birds. Single cordons, 12 inches apart, and also you can have triple and double cordons. Now, the beauty of these is that you can even grow them against a north-facing fence. Now, this form, the vertical cordon, is also suitable for red currants and white currants, but not the black currant. And they're grown to a height of about 5.5 feet.
In the alpine house, Primula pubescens flowered last April. It can be split now to give you more flowers next time. John Main.
Now we come back to the interesting job of increasing the plants that we've either got in pots or in the garden, and division is a method which we haven't looked at before. You can see this Primula pubescens is now getting rather congested. It's getting quite a long stem to the plant, and what we really want to do now is to knock it out of the pot and divide the plant up and increase them. And it's quite a simple job. Just tap it on the edge of the bench and hopefully it comes out. And as you can see, quite a lot of roots going actually down the side of the pot, which shows us that it now wants to be divided so that we can reinvigorate the plant. Just quickly take off most of the crops and then just gently tease away some of the soil from round the edge of the ball itself. Having removed that, some of the roots will fall off, but not to worry about them. And then just gently ease it apart. Just put your hands either side and just gently ease the plant apart. As you can see, it folds up and just the plants then fold up. Give it another shake till you get rid of most of the soil, and then you can start just to gently to ease it apart. Now you'll see we've at least, to begin with, got 2 new plants there. And the next job for us to do is to remove all the dead leaves from the stem, because when we repot the plant, we want to bury quite a lot of the stem. We don't want a long length of stem actually showing on the plant. Where you've actually torn the plant apart there may be sort of a ragged sort of a tear where infection could get into the plant. So just take a knife and just make a nice sharp cut there. If the material had been more rotten than that, then you probably would have to put a fungicide on, but that's nice and clean. Now, as we want to get the plant as far down into the pot, don't put any soil in to begin with, just gently get the roots in, because all the new roots will actually begin to form on the stem of the plant itself. So just fill up with any well-drained compost that we've used before for alpines and get that stem buried right down in the pot. And there you have a new one to actually to grow on as a pot and flower in the house, or to plant it out in the garden in the spring.
Now here's John Warwick with a place for those alpines that's somewhat out of the ordinary.
Well, now we've got a site here which we put larger plants in the front of the rock garden. We thought it'd be a rather nice thing to do if we built a scree here instead of having these taller plants at the bottom. The scree plants will be smaller, be more in keeping. Now, in order to make it, we want to make it slightly wider than this bed is here now. I could, if I wanted, leave this rope where it is. But if I do, it'll make the mowing line very difficult on this corner. Now, if I were to move that rope line round here, so that it goes further round, and the curve is the other way around, it'll make it a little bit narrow in the middle of the scree, but the grass itself will have a much better line. Just straighten it up. Take a look at it. That's a better line. It'll make it easier to mow, and this awkward bit here will be cut out altogether. So we've got no awkward corners. I'm just going to use a half moon, which is a nice, good cutting tool, and press down, just following more or less the curve of this rope here. It's just an old washing line. Now, as the soil in this case is quite dry, I could lift anywhere across here, across this line here. But again, be a bit careful with the pond, because the line is immediately underneath the fork.
We'll see how John Warwick's scree slope is completed next month. It'll eventually be planted with species which like free-draining soils. Wisley's rhododendrons are magnificent, and there are different types of blossom from February right through till midsummer. Many rhododendrons come from the woods and mountains of Eastern Asia, so they love cool, moist and shady conditions, as Dave Hutchins explains.
Well, we've got to the stage in this garden of developing this area. Now it's shaded by the building here, so it doesn't get very much direct sunlight. The soil here is well drained, it's acid, and it sort of would suit rhododendrons admirably.
In the wild, rhododendrons thrive on rich woodland loam, so we prepare the ground by digging in lots of peat.
We make the hole about twice the size of the root ball of the plant. Then we take some more peat and put 2 or 3 handfuls in the bottom of the hole. And this we mix into the hole so that it's readily there for the plant. And now we take a knife and slice the pot from the plant. Clean off any rubbish, weeds which are around the plant itself, and take off the dead leaves from within the plant. As you can see from the root ball of this plant, the nice white young fresh roots which are coming out from this side this is the sort of thing which you're looking for, because this will give you the plant getting into rapid growth as soon as it's put into the hole, rather than sitting while it makes the fresh roots. Having put the plant into the hole, we'll now fill it up with soil and then firm it lightly, because bearing in mind that the rhododendrons would naturally be growing in woodland soil, and the leaf litter which you get in woodlands is a very open medium. So this is the sort of soil condition which you're aiming for. Now, as you can see, the space between the plants is quite considerable. This is to allow for their ultimate size of growth. So initially we are going to have to plant in between. For example, this Yacusamanum will eventually make probably 3 feet across, but even at that stage we're still going to have space behind and space over here, and that won't be for 5 or 10 years.
Dave Hutchins has chosen for this site Rhododendron bric-a-brac, an early flowering hybrid. Rhododendron Elizabeth blooms in April and May. Rhododendron Yacusamanum Doc produces its flowers in early June. And the Azalea Rosebud is in bloom a month earlier. Our patio fig is ripening nicely, but Harry Baker's fig tree is on a grander scale.
Well, this is a fan-trained fig on a south or west-facing fence here, called brown turkey. It's root restricted, just like the pot-grown fig, and the figs are starting to ripen now. Well, how can you tell when the figs are ready to eat? Well, this is brown turkey and it is turning brown, but more importantly, you'll notice that the figs are starting to shrivel, the stalk has collapsed, and there's a slight crack developing on the fig itself, and it's soft. Sometimes the figs have a little drop of nectar in the eye of the fig. We call the tear. There's a tear in the eye of the fig when it's ready. But that's the main thing, it's shriveling and nice and soft. Now you'll notice that you've got these ripe figs, and then you've got these green figs. Well, we're running into September, October now, the weather is getting cooler. These figs here will not ripen in our climate, and these should be taken off, say, at the end of October. Now, these little figs here, called the embryo figs, those will protect, those will wrap up with bracken in the winter, give them a winter overcoat, thatch them against the fence here with open bracken, and next year they'll then ripen throughout next summer, I hope, and they'll become just like these here. So my final happy duty today is to taste one of these nice brown turkey figs. Let's see what it tastes like. Lovely.
And the second programme in this quartet of autumn features is at the same time next week.
At this time of the year, it's important to keep your eyes open in the garden for the well-known law of the cussedness of nature. And this foxglove here is a perfect example. It's very nice that they seed themselves all over my garden, but do they always have to do it right in the middle of a clump of beautiful cyclamen? Mind you, I'm not complaining really, because it's very easy to pull them out where they're not wanted and to leave them where they are. At this time of the year, it's very important to keep an eagle eye open for any seedlings that there might be around, and just make sure that you don't actually pull them out indiscriminately with the weeds. I've got a little pulmonaria over there, which I'm certainly going to leave to flower, because that could be quite a nice hybrid. And if you look very carefully at the cyclamen down here, you can see that they too are spreading themselves by seed, and they'll eventually produce a really nice clump. This is a really wonderful time of the year, isn't it? I promised a few weeks back that the Alpine house will be coming into its own about now, and now just look at it. These saxifrages are flowering their hearts out, and the flowers are really good quality because, of course, they're not subjected to the weather at all. But once they've finished flowering, they'll be much better off put outside. This is one that has really surprised and delighted me, Iris lazica. Now that is in fact very slightly tender really, so that's why that needs the Alpine house. Alternatively, it's a very good one for flowering on a sunny windowsill. This Dionysia has been an absolute picture for weeks now, but unfortunately it's been damaged by condensation dropping on the foliage. But not to worry, because there is a way that you can repair this and many other mound-forming plants that get damaged in the middle. First of all, just pull out the old dead stuff from the middle. It'll generally just come out quite easily like that. But of course, as you can see, that leaves quite a nasty hole there. And then get a couple of stones and just put them underneath like that. And that will actually close up the mound. The plant will eventually grow right over that and you'll never know it was damaged.
Many parts of the country had some pretty devastating weather last winter, and as always it's the trees that are the first to suffer. Here in my own village in Warwickshire, the churchyard yews really opened out like peeled bananas. But it's not the end of the day. You don't even need an expert to put them right. Some willing hands from the village, some strong wire, and you can pull them in. And in fact you can see here what it looks like when the job is finished. Almost as good as new. And the foliage of course will grow over and the wire will be concealed. And I actually think it's rather a good idea, if you have upright growing trees like this, to wire them anyway, simply as a precaution against snow damage. There are some trees though that you can't save with a bit of wire, I'm afraid, and this poor old apple really caught the full blast of the snow and the wind. There was nothing to protect it, and it's really beyond salvation. It's going to have to be cut up, cut down. If you're doing that and you're faced with this problem of getting an old tree out, then bear in mind you've got to think how the stump's going to be removed before you cut it down, because if you're going to winch it out, you'll need about 18 inches at the bottom of the stump to be left for the winch to get a purchase on. If winching isn't practical or the stump's too big, then you may need to get a contractor in with a stump grinding machine, and this is basically like a big mincer which will chew up the wood at the bottom of the stump and just leave you with a hole in the ground. There was actually rather a similar problem with one of the lovely may trees that lines the village street here. That was brought down by the snow, and that also left a stump in the ground. I think the local authority saw us coming because they hopped in last week and got the stump out. And the reason, of course, for wanting to take a stump out is so that you don't get honey fungus into the ground, because if that's in here or in your garden, that can create real problems. Then when you come to replant, and I hope you will want to replant, the nutrient in any event is going to be exhausted. So the new plant should go in maybe a couple of yards away from where the old one was growing. But not all trees need to be dug out, and there are one or two in my own garden that I think we can save with a bit of careful staking. And this is the patient over here. Well, strictly speaking, it's not a tree at all. It's actually my favourite shrub, which is Buddleia alternifolia. And I've trained it as a standard, and that's really why it has a fairly weak stem. It's a lovely shrub, but fairly weak. And what I'm going to have to do before I stake it is take some of this top growth off. Yes, it's surprising how much you do really need to take off. I don't think I need to do any more at the moment. It's now time to put on a tie. It's important to use one of these proper belt-style tree ties. They don't cost very much, and they give a much more secure hold, and they won't damage the tree. Put the buckle on the stake side, not on the tree side, so that the stem of the tree won't be damaged. And it's also important that the stake, which I put in earlier on, is actually on the upwind side of the tree, so the tree is blown away from the stake and not onto it, where it's likely to be abraded. And that really should secure it against the next lot of snow and the next lot of gales. I've already wired up my trees, and these are Lawson cypress elwoodii that the snow had opened out. And because I wired them rather more tightly than the yew trees in the churchyard, the wire would have cut into the stem had I not used these short lengths of plastic hose pipe slipped over the wire just to give the tree that little bit of extra protection. I really love old and twisted trees like this damson here. They've got real character. But the trouble is when they are very old, and especially if they have branches coming out as this one does at right angles, they're prone to be damaged even in a normal year by the weight of fruit, let alone the snow. So I think it's a good idea to give them a permanent prop, and that gives them some protection. But up at the top here is a branch that the snow did get the better of, and this is broken off and leaves rather a nasty jagged end. And what we need to do now is to tidy that up. Now, if this was a big branch, I'd actually need to saw a small wedge out from underneath to prevent it from splitting further down the trunk. As it's a small branch, I'm just going to cut a small slit underneath to prevent that, and then I'm going to saw from the top, and I'm not actually sawing absolutely flush with the trunk. I'm leaving a small collar, I suppose you could call it, at the base of the branch, and that's where the new tissue will form. Right, now that's left a nice clean surface there with a collar at the base, so the tree will be able to heal itself. Many people would now paint this surface with a wound sealing compound, but I don't recommend that. They don't work very well, and you can actually seal in decay fungi. It's far better to leave this collar at the base of the branch, and the tree will form what's called callus tissue, and that will seal over the wound itself very effectively. Here's another advantage of living in a village, the local. But just as the local pub engenders a community spirit, I think trees do as well. Whether you live in a town or a village, trees belong to all of us. They were there before we arrived, and many of them, we hope, will be there after we've gone. But if in the final analysis you have a tree that's so damaged it does have to be cut down, for goodness sake, replace it with another one instead. Good health.
If you haven't ordered your dahlias yet, then now's the time to do it. But do bear in mind that they are tender, so you need a frost-free greenhouse until they're planted out in late May or early June. Now, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and colours, of course. So last autumn, I went to Aylitz Nurseries in St Albans to see what's available. Well, Brian Fowler, you're the nursery manager here. You grow acres of dahlias. What should I be looking for in a dahlia?
You should be looking for something that gives you a good plant and a nice lot of flower right the way through the summer.
Well, there are lots of different shapes and sizes of dahlias. What is the most popular one?
The most popular one are the decorative type.
Now, this one is a decorative, isn't it? And this one, I believe, is one of your favourites.
That's right. It's called Biddenham Peach, and it gives you a nice, good, strong colour. There's also, you get a reasonable stem right the way through the summer.
It really is a wonderful colour, isn't it? What a super
yeah.
cut flower that is. But I'm still a bit confused because although you call this one a decorative, this one looks very much like it, and yet you call that a water lily.
Well, the difference being in a water lily to a decorative is that it's much flatter, and it looks just like the water lilies on a pond.
Well, it's a lovely colour, this one, isn't it? What is this?
This is autumn lustre.
Yes, a beautiful thing, isn't it? And this is one that you would recommend. And yet it's very much the same sort of colour as this one. So why is that better than this?
That's better because it's got a shorter length of stem between the top pair of leaves and the actual flower head itself. Whereas this one's got a very long neck.
So what's wrong with that then?
When it rains, it can fill up with water and droop.
So you've really got to get to know your varieties, haven't you? But the great thing about dahlias is that there are so many that you can have real variety in the garden. I've noticed one here with quilled petals.
Yes, that's Daddy's choice.
I love the spiky shape of those flowers, and of course they come in all sorts of colours too, don't they? This is very eye-catching.
This is very eye-catching in that it's Lady Sunshine, a very nice yellow in that you get plenty of flower and it's good for cutting right the way through the summer.
And there are good pink varieties of this
There's good
too.
pink varieties in the way of Pink Shirley Alliance, which is an excellent variety again, which will give you a nice strong colour right the way through the summer.
I must say though, Brian, that for the border and for cut flowers as well, I'm very fond of the collarette varieties.
Collarettes are something that's a little bit different in the way that you've got this collar on the inside of the petals, and they do also are good for cutting and will flower right the way through the summer.
What is this variety?
This particular variety is Chimborazo.
Very, very nice. Now, most of these varieties are what, 3 foot to 3'6" tall. What about if I've got a small garden?
If you've got a small garden, I would suggest as we use some of the poms. We're talking about Rhonda, which is a small pom, and it grows into a nice perfect ball.
Yes, I'm always amazed at how perfectly symmetrical these blooms are, almost as if they've been made with a machine.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, there are the bedding dahlias.
Well, the bedding dahlias are ideal for somebody who's got a very small garden. There's quite a wide range of colour you can go through, but the ones I particularly like is orange mullet, with its nice bright orange colour that will flower right the way through the summer with no problems at all.
And that looks really good, doesn't it? What about new varieties, Brian?
New varieties that we're talking now, General Pastel, which is a nice medium semi-cactus. You've got Catherine's Cupid, which the show people I think are going to like, which is a small ball, and Pink Jupiter, which again comes into the very giant semi-cactus.
Now, dahlias actually aren't that difficult to grow, Brian, are they?
No, they're not difficult at all. They'll tolerate any soil at all, that they'll grow virtually anywhere.
But they do like a bit of sunshine.
Like a nice little bit of sunshine and plenty of water.
So does that mean special soil preparation?
The soil preparation, you want to incorporate some farmyard manure or some garden compost when you prepare the ground itself the year before.
Well, we won't, of course, be planting out until about June time, but when you do, what about fertiliser?
Fertiliser, a good general fertiliser is recommended, but not anything that's got a very high nitrogen content, because you'll get a lot of leafy growth.
And do you need to feed during the season?
We need to feed during the season, and you put on a superphosphate to help the root growth and the tuber formation, and the potash on to help to make the flowers and the plant sturdy.
And when would you do that?
The second week in August.
Oh, it all sounds easy enough. What about pests and diseases?
The worst disease you can get is Dahlia mosaic virus, which you can get, and it's transmitted from plant to plant by aphids.
And is that carried actually in the tubers and the plants?
It can be carried in the tubers and the plants as well. It can be carried in both of them.
So how can I avoid that?
You can avoid it by buying from a reputable company and also controlling the aphids.
Well, now, you don't actually sell tubers, do you? You only sell plants?
No, we only sell plants for the simple reason that we can see the health of the plant, and if there is any disease or any malformality in it, we just don't bother with them at all, we just bin them.
Well, dahlias are favourite flowers for showing, and I want to win the village show next year, so I want to grow the biggest dahlia in Rutland. How do I do that?
Well, the first thing you've got to remember is to choose a suitable variety. Some varieties to choose are Alfred C, which is a giant semi-cactus orange. You've also got BJ Beauty, which is an ideal show variety, but not quite as large. Or how about that one, Jeff?
Oh yeah, that is just the job, isn't it? What a beauty. What is that one?
That's Hamari Gold.
It's lovely, isn't it? But how can I make sure that I get that really big?
The way to do that is to, when they're planted out and growing, restrict the growth to just 4 shoots. And then you'll find they'll come up, and once they get to the bud stage, if they need this budding, so as you just leave the crown bud in.
And then I'll get a real prize winner.
Then you'll get a real prize winner.
From the air, even a large city like London reveals that it's not just the grey of concrete. There's lots of garden as well, ranging from large public parks to private squares. There are over 450 in London alone. One of them, nestling in the shadow of Westminster Cathedral, is Eccleston Square, which last September looked a picture, a credit to those who organise its maintenance, led by horticulturist and photographer Roger Phillips.
In 1828, Thomas Cubitt got a lease on the whole area, the whole of Pimlico, from the then Duke of Westminster. He then cleared out the market gardeners who were here at the time, must have been a bit of a tragedy for them,
Yes.
and started building, and he was very keen on the idea of having garden squares. They had garden squares further north in Mayfair and so on. So they planned the whole area in a very organised way with long avenues and squares running through. They started laying out Eccleston Square, I think 1835 it was probably laid out. And I imagine these planes and so on were planted there, you know, so that it would have been shortly after that much as you see it now in layout. We haven't interfered with the basic pattern of the paths, and obviously the big trees have gone right through.
How long have you been involved with it?
The Garden Committee caught on to me about 10 years ago and said, would I like to be on? Because they discovered I do books on plants, and they thought he could be useful, we'll fit him in somewhere. So lo and behold, they made me what they call honorary garden manager, which means I'm responsible for the planting and things, which means I spend half my time doing it, of course.
Right. This square is obviously very different, one might say rather more elegant than most. What exactly have you been up to in those 10 years?
Well, we've tried to make it a garden. It's a private square, and of course it is essentially the garden of the houses. They don't have back gardens. And I mean, people walk around and say, look at you with your privileged square. It's rubbish. This is our back garden. But in a sense, it's more like a village green. It's a sort of meeting place for all the people who live here. I mean, everybody uses it at one time or another. We have parties and so on. So we're like a tiny little village community in the middle of a great big city.
Well, it all looks very lovely, but how do you pay for the maintenance?
The Garden Committee have the right to impose a garden rate on everybody. It's in the leases. So we make them all pay. They pay, in fact, at the moment, 65 quid each per flat, about the price of a window box, and they get this. I hope they like it. Well, over here we had originally potting sheds, and they were completely rotted, and in fact people had obviously been living in them at various times, and we knocked the whole lot down and ended up with a derelict area with lumps of concrete and so on, and decided to make a patio, and sort of place where we could catch the heat so people could sit out and enjoy themselves.
I've seen fancy brickwork before, but this is about as la-di-da as it can get. It's gorgeous. What's the idea of the different patterning?
I'm passionate about mosaics. It's another one of my interests, and in fact it's the centre part is a repeating square pattern, and then it has this herringbone pattern, and then here it's got the basket weave with the overlapping shapes.
That's gorgeous. But on the planting, I noticed you've got some nice colourful things like begonias, and I love the variegated nasturtium, but also I noticed pot herbs, lemon thyme and curry plant. And over there, even salad burnet, which is a pretty humble wild plant, but somehow it looks right, doesn't it, on here?
It's the most wonderful thing, isn't it? I mean, because it's in full leaf all the way through the winter, looks wonderful, and of course you can eat it.
Well, you're jolly lucky having all these enormous plane trees in the square. But what about the recent storms? Did you lose many?
We lost loads. We lost 17 trees, unbelievably, in the garden. Complete destruction. And here we had an enormous tree, and I decided to have a go with silver birch, which I had this sort of vision of columns put close together, white columns. Not being a trained horticulturalist, I put them very close. I don't know whether you think they're too close.
I think they'll look marvellous. The other thing I notice is that you've got a great many tender plants, like this mimosa, for instance.
It's an absolute beauty, isn't it? Look at the lovely colour of the foliage. And the flower buds just coming. It'll flower in the winter. It's superb. And we're able to grow these plants, of course, all over the garden because we get this wonderful buffer of temperature in central London. 5, 6, 7 degrees from the temperatures outside London. The yellow butylon overwinters here. It's a superb plant, isn't it? We've had that for 3 years.
Have you? And what about that loquat next door?
We've got 3 in the garden. They're completely self-seeded. I don't know where they came from.
People must have been eating the fruit and chucking the bits down, I
suppose.
Well,
that's it, or chucking away rotten ones.
Right. Now, the nasturtium relatives are marvellous plants anyway, but this one, Tropiolum speciosum, that's been going bananas here, hasn't it?
Yes. A year ago, someone gave me one tuber, and I planted it. I then got a bucketful, and I've spread it absolutely everywhere, and I've got it climbing over everything. You see, it's running up here, up over here. I absolutely adore it, and I love this sort of profusion of plants. I love the plants that keep sort of filling out every single space, you know, to make a lovely full area.
Well, that's okay, but look, this is great. A celandine, isn't it? Now, what are you doing allowing all that to spread over there? It's a bit of a weed, isn't it?
Yes, you think it's a dreadful weed, don't you? I love it. I absolutely love it. I mean, it's got this absolutely magical yellowy orange sap, which is supposed to be a cure for frigidity, by the way, if you know anybody who needs a cure for that. And it has superb foliage, lasting all year, lovely little yellow flowers. I can't think of a better plant, really, as a ground cover.
The thing that I love about this little corner as well is that it's so private here. It's enclosed, and yet you can hardly believe we're right in the heart of London.
Well, that's right. It's my secret garden.
But the whole square abounds with little elements of surprise and little corners.
Yes, we try to sort of develop plants as they seem to do well and encourage them to carry on.
This has worked well, hasn't it? This Caryopteris and Crocosmia,
yes, I mean,
that looks lovely together.
Just a sort of coincidence, really, but it's gorgeous together, isn't it? But have you seen this over here? This is another one of our real specialities.
Oh, yes.
That's Senecio rotundifolia. I haven't ever seen it really growing outside Cornwall.
No, that's lovely, and it's tender, of course.
It is tender, yes,
but
very tender.
The Actia you've got, no, there's nothing tender about that. That's a North American species.
No,
but I've never seen one look quite as peculiar as this.
It's really very funny. You know, it's called doll's eyes, with those little white berries on the end of the red stem. Normally there's only one berry on each stem. Mine's got a little sort of crown of berries. It's really very odd, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes it look more like bullseyes than doll's eyes.
Yeah, perhaps bullseyes would be a better name for it.
Well, Roger, how can you be sure that a square as lovely as this is going to be maintained for future generations?
You can't. It's a terrifying prospect. People want to build on them, to develop them, to put car parks under them. But what we've done is formed a society called the Society of Protection of London Squares. And what it is a group of square garden committees, basically, the people in the squares. And we're determined to fight and to stick to our guns and make sure nothing ever happens to them. We think of them as the lungs of London. And without lungs to breathe, London will die. So they're safe, we hope, in our hands.
This year I've treated my allotment to a posh new fruit cage. I get a lot of bird damage up here, and the cage is covered tightly with netting, and that provides 100% protection against birds and also avoids getting them caught up in loose netting, which is quite distressing. It is a bit expensive, I'm afraid. This one is 15 feet by 15 feet and it costs £240. But do bear in mind that the bigger the fruit cage, then the cheaper it is per square yard covered. But it's surprising what you can get into a small space like this. First of all, the summer fruiting raspberries. I've got three varieties here. This one is the very vigorous and early Glen Clover. Then a new variety, Glencoe, which has very well flavoured purple berries and spineless stems. And then there's Glenprosen, which is a mid-season variety with an extremely good flavour. After planting, prune them down to about 6 or 9 inches, and then they need to be supported by a strong post and wire structure. And they're followed in harvesting by the autumn variety, Autumn Bliss. And if you haven't got Autumn Bliss, then take my advice and get it. It's a superb flavour, and it'll go on cropping right the way through to the first hard frosts. And that, of course, doesn't need any support at all. On the north side of the cage, there's the thornless loganberry, and here a row of black currants. Now, when you plant black currants, they need to be planted a little bit deeper than they grew on the nursery, and then they must be pruned really hard back, right down to the ground, in order to produce some vigorous young shoots for fruiting next year. Now, the trouble with black currants is that they're big, vigorous bushes, but this variety, Ben Sarek, is much more compact, and these can be planted 3 foot apart. The best way of growing white currants, red currants and gooseberries in a small garden is as cordons, because they take up only a few inches of space. Now, these are single cordons, and they're planted a foot apart and trained up these canes, and then in the summer you prune back to these spurs, and they carry an enormous crop of fruit. You can also buy them as double cordons, where they're planted 2 foot apart, but each one of these arms is trained a foot apart. You can even get them as triple cordons, where you plant against the middle cane and then train each arm up against the sides, again a foot apart. Now, these are a bit difficult to come by, but what you could do is to do what I did and go to the nursery and sort out a 2-dimensional plant. Now, this is one-sided, so it's not really a very good plant, so you might even get it a bit cheaper, but it's ideal for what you want, because you could prune this into a perfect triple cord. Now, there's a great competition in Radio Times with £25,000 worth of lawn care products to win, and it's very easy. All you've got to do is answer 2 questions this week and 2 questions next week. This week's questions are, why should you put tea bags into a watering can when you're watering rhododendrons? Is it because it makes the water more alkaline? Does it make it more acid? Or does it add potassium? And the second question, when should you prune autumn fruiting raspberries? Immediately after flowering, in the spring, or in the winter? All the details are in Radio Times, and with that sort of prize, don't miss it. Well, next week, Nigel Coburn's off to Belgium to visit the garden of one of our European viewers. And Swithenbank will be looking at a range of easy-to-grow orchids, and I'll be visiting an important seminar to canvass a range of views on the controversial subject of peat and peat alternatives. And of course, as always, there's plenty to do here at Barnsdale. Goodbye. What a marvellous time of the year this is. And I'll tell you what, on a day like this, there's no better place to spend it than in the garden. Here at Barnsdale, it's looking and smelling wonderful. And with the sun shining, I should be able to make the first cut on the lawn. And if you have trouble composting the grass cuttings, and that's a secret I want to let you into today, and with all that wonderful compost you're going to make, you can grow yourself some good organic vegetables. That's something else I should be doing later on. But you've got to savour the garden a bit first of all, and just have a look at this wonderful shrub. Forsythia, of course, is common as muck, but do bear in mind that a lot of these common shrubs are common because they're jolly good. This one never lets me down. It flowers like this every single year. And of course, there are lots of varieties of Forsythia. One of the best is Carl Sachs, which has big butter yellow flowers. But of course, they don't have to be big shrubs. If you've got a very small garden, you could grow Forsythia viridissima bronxensis, which I grow in my little rock garden here. It'll never grow to more than about 2 feet tall, just coming into flower now, and that later on will look wonderful. Mind you, it's a little bit upstaged by those anemone blanda in the front, which in the sunshine look terrific. In the ornamental kitchen garden, growing vegetables is a bit different. It's an idea that's tailor-made for small gardens because instead of growing in long rows in a special veg plot, you grow them in patches in amongst the flowers. Now, the essence of this is high fertility, so every time before you sow or plant, you want some good compost over the top of the patch, because bear in mind, everything is going to be competing with everything else. You're growing an awful lot in this garden. Keep up the plant food, a little bit of pelleted chicken manure, just a handful over the top is ideal, and then just work it in with a border fork. Once you start this method, it really is very easy work, because that really is all you've got to do. Just smooth it out with the back of the fork. Now, I'm growing a new carrot here called Banga. It's a good little early carrot, and I'm going to grow it in rows, just scratched out with a stick, round about 3 to 4 inches apart. The packet says 6, but I'm going to pull these young, so there's no need to get them in that far apart. And just sprinkle them thinly down the rows and do all the rows first. It's a good idea to grow in rows actually rather than just broadcasting them, because that way if weeds come up you know that the plants you want are the ones in the straight lines. Just cover up with your hand, pat down the surface, make sure that you know where they are by just putting a few sticks in there just to remind you that they're there, and of course don't forget the label, and Bob's your uncle. Now, a lot of people ask me how on earth you can grow potatoes in this sort of system. Well, actually nothing could be easier, because what you do is you plant them in individually in amongst the flowers, putting them in with a trowel, get them as deep as you can, prepare the ground of course exactly the same as before, put them in nice and deep. They'll come up, the foliage looks marvellous amongst the flowers, and then you can harvest them individually and give yourself a succession right the way through the summer.
Outside in the garden you may not be having too many problems with pests at the moment, but inside it's a completely different matter because the protected environment has given them a head start. Some common pests, like soft scale, are able to attack plants outside like camellias and holly, but inside they also love houseplants and are particularly fond of citrus. What you see to start off with are pale brown or yellowish coloured scales, only a couple of millimetres long, tightly clustered on the foliage and even sometimes on the stems. If you don't notice those to start off with, what you will see is a slight distortion of the leaves, which tend to be a little bit yellowed as well. And in addition, you'll find that the leaves are covered in a sticky substance called honeydew, which is in fact the excreta of the scale insects, which they flick out all over the foliage. If you catch an infestation like this early, you can usually get rid of it simply by swabbing the leaves with soapy water. But in a severe case, you're probably best off using an insecticide. Something like malathion or cybole does a wonderful job, but unfortunately, because these particular pests breed throughout the year, you're going to have to spray very frequently. But remember to always choose your insecticides really carefully, because some can damage certain houseplants, so always check the label before you begin. When you're spraying a plant against red spider mite, like this one has got, you're again going to have to spray really frequently, but this time it's because although the insecticide may have some effect against the adults, it won't have any effect at all against the eggs. This particular plant isn't too badly damaged. There's a little bit of yellowing and mottling of the foliage here, and it's beginning to die back slightly along the centre, but on the whole it really isn't that awful. And you could actually get quite good control if you simply put it on a tray of moist pebbles and then regularly mist it just with plain water. You'll create a lovely humid environment and the plant will thrive, but the red spider mite certainly won't. But if you don't do anything fast enough, you may well end up with something looking rather like this, completely devastated, with the foliage covered in mottling and also a lot of silken fibres produced by the mites. With something like this, there's really nothing to do other than put it in the bin. This Dracaena is definitely another candidate for the bin, but having said that, it's also a really good example of another common houseplant pest, the mealybug. This particular pest thrives in the hot and often rather humid conditions we try and create for the plants, and it's literally sucked this one dry. The pests are clustered tightly all over the foliage and even down the stems. Each white fluffy clump is actually made up of large numbers of individual insects, each of which rather resembles a kind of miniature woodlouse, but a sort of pinkish grey colour, and covered in white waxy filaments. These filaments actually form a very good protective barrier for the mealybug, which means that when you try and spray against it, it's very difficult to get the spray to penetrate, so these particular pests are very hard to control. This cactus has only just become infested, and although you could spray against it, perhaps fairly successfully, it would be worthwhile just trying to paint the individual colonies of the pest with a solution of the insecticide. That way you'll get more accurate control, but even then you'll still have to repeat the process many times if you're going to kill off the mealybugs completely. But the worst pest you're likely to find in your houseplants is definitely the vine weevil. It's particularly fond of begonias and cyclamens and geraniums, but in fact it will attack most pot-grown houseplants. At first you may not be quite sure what's responsible, but you will see the leaves start to deteriorate and go yellow, and the plants look really rather sorry for themselves. You may even see signs of the adult vine weevils. These are just under 1 centimetre long and a dull mattish black colour with pale brown flecks all over their backs. They move slowly in and around the foliage, generally at night. In fact, they do very little damage. The real culprits are the grubs of these vine weevils. These will chew away at corms and tubers, and on a plant like this poor coleus, which hasn't got a tuberous root system, the vine weevil grubs will simply chew away at all the roots until there's nothing left. And if you take the plant out of the pot and look in amongst the compost, you should be able to find some of the larvae there. They're about 1 centimetre long, but they're always tightly curled into a little C shape. A pale brown body with a darker brown head and no legs at all. They've got a very voracious appetite, and even 1 or 2 of these in the compost can do an awful lot of damage. This coleus is definitely past the point of trying to save it, but you may find that when you take the compost off the root balls of your plants, the root systems are actually not too badly damaged. And if that's the case, it's definitely worth trying to wash off all the compost, and you should get rid of the majority of the vine weevil larvae and their eggs. And then you can repot it into fresh compost and water with a chemical like BHC or Cybol. But even if you do that, I certainly can't promise complete control, because unfortunately the larvae seem to be very resilient. But there is a form of biological control available. At the moment it's only for use by commercial growers, but hopefully it won't be long before it's on the amateur market.
What do you look for in a garden plant? Colour, shape, style? Well, it's probably a combination of all, but certain plant families have more than the usual of that je ne sais quoi that gives them character. And at this time of year, it's the hellebores. They belong to the buttercup family, Ranunculaceae, and grow wild in Europe and Asia. But they've been cultivated since ancient times, mainly for medicinal purposes, but they've long been favourites in old-fashioned and modern gardens. They're herbaceous, evergreen, and apart from the odd exception, fully hardy and easy to grow in just about any soil. Well, these are the most widely grown hellebores in English gardens. In fact, this one is a British native, Helleborus foetidus, or stinking hellebore. It's dead easy. Almost as easy from Corsica is the Helleborus argutifolius with apple green flowers and these interesting spines along the edge of the leaf. But probably the most familiar of all is the Christmas rose, Helleborus niger, which has been popular in British gardens for centuries. Well, we've come down to Wiltshire to visit the garden of Jeremy Wood, and he's a passionate collector of hellebores. He has a wonderful range of species and varieties in all sorts of shapes and colours. In fact, he is one of the national collection holders for the National Council for the Conservation of Plants and Gardens. Well, Jeremy, what made you get involved with the NCCPG?
Well, I think there's just so many garden plants that are threatened that you must have an organisation which is concerned with protecting them.
And with you it's hellebores?
With me it's hellebores.
So presumably all these hybrids stem from wild species?
Yes, and the one that's been used most often is orientalis, which in the wild is a greeny white colour. But by crossing it with other species, you get a tremendous range of different colours, different forms, different shapes.
There's even a yellow one, isn't there?
There's a yellow one, and the yellow colour has been introduced by crossing orientalis with odorus. Of course, you don't get a yellow straight away in the first generation, but by selecting and continuing the process of crossing, after a few generations, you will finish up with a yellow colour.
What about other shades?
This little species called torquatus, which as you see is smoky mauve on the outside, has been used to produce most of the dark purples and blues that are around today, and it even has a different colour inside from outside, and that contrast comes through in some of its hybrids.
Well, some hellebores are plain inside, others have marvellous spots and streaks. Now, how do you select for that effect?
Because some forms of orientalis in the wild have spots, and some also have a pink coloration, and you can get a combination of the two in the wild. And both those characteristics have been bred into the hybrids that we see.
Well, presumably all these hellebores will hybridise freely with each other. How do you prevent that and get exactly the cross that you want?
Here are two hellebores that I want to cross. I'm going to put the pollen from that one onto the stigma of this one. But I'm not going to choose a flower that's wide open, because that will already have been pollinated by a bee. Choose one that is closed. You can be quite sure that no bee has visited that one, so it hasn't yet been pollinated. With my fingers, I'm going to gently prise apart the sepals and expose the stigma. Then it's a simple business just to transfer the pollen from that flower to the stigma of this one. And make sure you label the flower, giving the details of the cross.
So what you might have in there in a few years' time is a lovely new variety. But if I want to build up my collection, how do I go about getting really good named cultivars?
That can be difficult because the named cultivars are in short supply, but the best thing is to go to a specialist nursery and choose some of the unnamed hybrids listed by colour in the catalogue. Go when they're in flower, because that's a good time to choose them. And in fact, some of my very best hellebores are unnamed seedlings that I've bought from a nursery and chosen when they're in flower.
And I suppose a good place to start looking might be in the plant finder.
Yes, that's exactly what I would advise.
Right, now, supposing I've got a decent seedling and it's so good I want to multiply it. Now, I know that it won't come totally true from seed, so I suppose I've got to, do it by division?
By division, yes. But there are different ways of dividing a plant. And this is how I'm going to divide it. I dug up this plant and washed all the soil off the roots to see exactly where to make the cut without damaging the new shoots which are here. Now there seems to be a natural point of division in this plant, and I'm going to make the first cut there. And with any luck, I can cut cleanly through this, and I will finish up with two plants.
How many do you think you'll get altogether from that?
I should think I would get about 8.
Well, we've done our division, Jeremy. Now, what about aftercare? They're pretty easy to look after, aren't they?
Oh, they are, given a reasonable soil, but they're hungry feeders and they benefit from either good mulch or something like a rose fertilizer.
And it doesn't matter whether you want to have one of all the rarities or whether you just want a lovely, colourful drift like this. Don't they make a marvellous link between winter and spring?
Oh, they do.
And I'll tell you the one that I really like, and that's this one here. I think that's absolutely exquisite.
And you know that is just an unnamed seedling.
So if you germinate every seed and make sure that you let every one flower, you may end up with something as good as this.
Considering that we're a nation of garden lovers, it's surprising how many of us actually find gardening to be a chore. Well, the Horticultural Trades Association are going to change all that. They've decided that 1991 is to be Easy Gardening Year, and spearheading their campaign is one of our best-loved actresses, Susan Hampshire. But as you can see, Susan is no mere figurehead. She manages to combine a very busy career. At present, she's starring in a touring production of The King and I, with some real hands-on gardening at her Oxfordshire home. Well, for easy gardening, Susan, this looks like jolly hard work to me.
No, on the contrary. I think mulching is one of the best ways of keeping the weeds down, of keeping the moisture in the soil, and also I think of feeding the soil, and it's a lovely thing to be able to use stuff from your kitchen waste, all your grass cuttings, and then put it back into the soil, the leaf, mould. I mean, it's really beautiful
I can
stuff.
see it's beautiful. Smells good.
Yes.
Feels good.
I get great joy from it.
I can see you do. You're revelling in this, aren't you? And you use the tumbler compost maker. You find that works well?
Well, I use that, and we've got a lot of pens, and all my friends that have got their kitchen waste, I take their kitchen waste. I mean, I'm a compost fanatic, and I think for mulching it is absolutely wonderful. Really wonderful.
So your favourite Christmas present is a bucket of somebody else's potato peelings.
That's right, yes.
They bring them round for you.
Well, obviously you need a lot of ground cover plants. I mean, I've got them all over the garden. Whoops. I don't want to spoil my nice edges. in some areas of the garden I really have to rely on a lot of ground cover plants, and here where it's sloping and it gets very dry, I just need something that's going to take over, and this ajuga, which has a lovely blue flower later in the year,
Yes.
is really splendid.
Yes, this is the purple-leaved ajuga or bugle. In fact, it's a
Yes.
form of a native British plant, and you often see it growing naturally on a dry slope like that, so very appropriate to retain moisture on the sloping
And
bed
if you were
here.
here, you know, later on, you'd see this lovely, I mean, the most vibrant blue. It's
Yes.
really very pretty.
Delightful. And over there,
Well, then there's what I call a white nettle. I don't know what its
Dead
proper
nettle,
name.
a dead nettle.
Yes. And it also has a nice white flower and a variegated leaf.
That
and it
ju-
also spreads. And the nice thing about these ground cover plants is that they all can be dug up. If they go too wild, you just dig up a bit and use it elsewhere where you need it.
and I think I can see one of my own favourite ground cover plants over there.
Yes, variegated periwinkle. It's absolutely wonderful. And in the summer, it will spread right to 3-4 feet and really cover all the ground. It's so pretty. And the flowers in the spring are such a lovely colour.
And over there, another very good ground cover plant, geraniums.
Ah, yes, this geranium wargrave pink is absolutely wonderful. It's worth its weight in gold, and it spreads, and you can divide it. It comes up every year, and it has little pink flowers, which are very, very pretty. Also, I think another very good ground cover is, there's a lot of it in the garden, is Alchemilla monis, lady's mantle, and it's really also so pretty.
I think Alchemilla is so beautiful when you get the little droplets of water on the leaves,
Yes.
little beads of mercury.
Yes.
But you make an interesting distinction there between the all year round ground cover, like the
Yes.
bugle and so on, and the geraniums and the Alchemilla, which are summer ground cover
And
only.
they die down, and you don't know that they're there, and then you suddenly get a lovely surprise the following year.
Tell me, Susan, how do you choose plants for particular places? Is it by accident, or do you look in books, or how does it come about?
I don't look in books because I'm not very good at reading, really. So I've discovered everything little by little on my own. I start off by saying, I want a basic black dress, and I know that there are things that are really useful, and they're good evergreen flowering shrubs, or nice things like the Senecio, that will really, really serve the garden. So there'll be big shrubs. And then I choose the plants because I realise I've got an area that I can't cope with because I've put the wrong plant in, and it gets dry and I've put the wrong kind of plant in. So it's really trial and error, and when I've made a big mistake, which I've made a lot of, I have to be bold and say I've made a terrible mistake and shut the stuff out completely. It's very hard to do though, because nobody wants to throw away a living thing.
No, I'm delighted to hear you say you make mistakes. Name 2.
Oh gosh, I've made so many. Firstly, I think the worst mistake I made was planting before I had lived in the house a year and got to know the garden and got to discover what was in it. And secondly, I've put plants in before I really understood the colours. I'm not very fond of yellow in the summer. I like whites, blues and pinks, and so therefore I've put in things which have come out rather too strong in colour for my taste, and also been a clash. So little by little I've learnt these mistakes, and I've just had to say, well, they can't stay there, and take them out, and somebody else wants them. So it's not as if they've been thrown to the dustbin.
So nothing's wasted. Well, coming back to the idea of easy gardening, and in fact coming back to ground cover, we're actually crouching down on some ground cover here, which is a pretty extensive area of grass. Now, surely that isn't easy gardening. Is it all this lawn?
Well, I only have the smart lawn near the house. The rest of it is wild. I'll show you. When you get to the lavender, this is the end of what I call the posh bit of the lawn. And this great trellis here, which doesn't look at all attractive at the moment, in fact is going to be a waterfall of roses in 3 different coloured pinks, and it'll be quite beautiful eventually, but at the moment it looks a bit bare, but they haven't got established yet.
My goodness. Is that 10,000 am I seeing at a glance?
Well, at least 40,000 or more. But it's funny, you have 40,000 daffodils and it doesn't look very much, does it?
Swallows them up.
Yes. This is only mowed after the daffodils have died down.
So you wait, what, 6 weeks before you mow them?
A good 6 weeks, yes. And then, of course, it always looks a little bit sort of dead, the ground afterwards, because it's not so green as it would be normally. And then I feed before I actually do the mowing. I actually sprinkle bone meal right through every single patch of every clump of daffodils, and I think that this does improve the quality of the daffodils myself.
And you're not going to tell me that with 40,000 daffodils you actually deadhead them?
I'm afraid I do, but that's because I think that they benefit from it and that the goodness goes back into the into the bulb rather than staying in the dead head of the daffodil.
Well, yes, I'm sure
That's a preference for me. I'm sure it's... I find it very therapeutic, is all I can say.
The word I'd use is masochistic.
Yes. And when the daffs have died down, and then, of course, there are bluebells, so, in fact, there's a sort of never-ending chain of bulbs right up until sort of early summer.
Well, from vast rolling acres of daffodils to something much smaller, but I'd guess a pretty difficult area, this.
Well, it's west-facing, west-north facing, so it doesn't get much sun. It's very, very dry because of the walls, but in a way it's my most successful space of the garden. And 8 years ago I put all these evergreen flowering shrubs in, things like elephant ears and hellebores, and all I can say is that I've neglected it for 8 years. I know it needs a prune now, but in fact it's flourished, and it really is so happy-making that here I have, you'd arrive at the house and something is looking joyful, waiting to greet you.
Absolutely. You'll be delighted to know that Susan has set down her ideas for easy gardening, and quite clearly her practical hints do work, and they're evidenced by this beautiful garden of hers that we see all around us. So take Susan's advice, and perhaps this will be the year that your gardening ceases to be a chore and becomes a delight.
It's a sure sign of spring when you've got to start cutting the lawn, but actually it's a job that I love. But as with all plants, I believe in doing things gradually and treating plants gently. So to start with, I'll only be mowing. I won't be doing any raking or weeding or feeding or anything like that, just mowing. And even that I take carefully. The first job is to lower the roller on the mower so that you raise the cutters, so that you're just taking off the very top of the grass. And then on subsequent cuts you can lower it until you get down to the level that you want. Now when I mow, I start off by going round the outside, and that avoids me damaging any plants that are in the borders. It's also a good idea for the very finest lawn to mow in the opposite direction each week, and that way any grass that the rollers might have laid down and not cut is picked up when you go in the opposite direction. But of course, if you're mowing up and down, that's extremely difficult to arrange because you can't remember which way you went last week. But you can do it going across diagonally. This week I started in this corner and I went across this way, and next week I'll start in the other corner and go across in the opposite direction. And to remind myself where I am, I have a little peg which I stick in the corner, and then I know exactly what I'm doing. When you've mowed, one job that I would do is always to cut the edges, but this can be a little bit of a stressful job because you're sort of half leaning forward, and that's a very bad position for the back. So I'm quite pleased to see these edging shears, which have got adjustable handles. You can adjust them so that your back is absolutely straight, like that, just to suit you, and away you go. Now the grass cuttings from the lawn are going to make the very best compost that you could possibly imagine, but only if you know how to do it. The first thing you need is 2 compost bins, one to rot down while the other one's filling up. So I've made a double one out of old floorboards. Note that there are no air spaces in the sides and that the front here is removable. This cost £50, but if you bought the wood second hand, you could certainly cut the price in half. Now, the secret with grass cuttings is that if you just pile them in, you'll find that they rot down to form a slimy mass. So the secret is to keep plenty of air within the heap. And the way to do that is to treat yourself to a bag of horse manure. There's plenty of this around now. Just put a bit of horse manure in with the grass cutting, shake it up nicely, turn it over like that, so that you get the grass cuttings and the horse manure well mixed, and you'll find that that will rot down to form a beautifully brown, crumbly compost. Well, next week, Stefan visits an international alpine show in Warwick. And if you're an alpine enthusiast, believe me, this show is a knockout, so don't miss it. Nigel is here, continuing his creative planting spot in the small garden, and I'll be visiting the Cottage Garden Society's seed expert to get all the information on collecting and growing your own. And of course I'll be reminding you of the seasonal jobs here at Barnsdale. Goodbye.
Hello again. Today Garden Club has come to meet gardeners in East Kent within a stone's throw of Dover. And despite the time of year, they've still been coping with a drought restriction order right up until now. Today I'll be picking up some tips on how to create the perfect lawn. And if you're feeling particularly environmentally conscious, then Matthew Biggs may have just the thing for you if you want to stop using peat in your garden.
One of the most commonly met with problems in gardens is what to plant beneath a large tree. Well, here in Anna Turner's garden at Aythorne, the tree is the beech, notorious for its dense shade. So how did you cope with this, Anna?
Well, what we did, we mulched the ground very well to start with. We put a lot of horse manure, mushroom, because as you can see, it's a very, very heavy, really heavy clay area up here. And then afterwards we put wood chips down to keep the weeds at bay and to keep the moisture in the ground during these very hot summers that we've had.
Interesting to see the shrubs you've used too. The Lonicera pileata there, the little shrubby honeysuckle. That's certainly doing a good job, isn't it?
Yes,
Very happy in shade.
Yes, that's quite happy there. It was a trial shrub. We weren't quite sure whether it would be suitable there, but it seems to be thriving under this very heavy leafed beech.
I'm surprised to see the Senecio, sunshine it's called now, but it's what's very commonly called Senecio grey. Was that flower here?
Yes, it flowers just a little, not too much because of this dark area, but I mean it does flower in the summer.
The Oregon grape, Mahonia aquifolium, that grows beneath trees in woods in the wild in western North America, and obviously he's very happy there, flowering. And this ground cover Euonymus fortunei.
But we're hoping to sort of get that spread more over as a ground cover under the shrubs.
See, you've also got that another form of this Euonymus fortunei, Emerald Gaiety there. That's a nice silver margin one. Now, if you grow that from cuttings, that's easy from cuttings in summer. You could fill in some of the gaps. Add some winter colour.
Yes. Well,
also with this golden one.
With the golden one, we're trying to create a yellow area here. I think I've got a problem here with this snowball bush. It's just taking over everything.
Yeah, I think you've got three problems, to be honest, Anna. You've got the little plant in the background by the wall, Symphytum grandiflorum, and that creeps like the plague. You can see it's running in every direction there. That you need to dig up every piece, and it's all right in a woodland situation, good ground cover, but out of a border like this, the snowball bush, that too, that's going to get too big for this position. I suspect that if you dig that up, you'll find there are at least 5 or 6 pieces from that because it's suckering, so you'll have that many plants. Don't dig it up though now until next winter. It's already breaking now, you're too late this year. And then there's a berberis by the side of it there, which is going to be a very big and very prickly shrub in that situation. And in their place, I'm going to suggest you plant this. This is a Euonymus called Elatus, the winged spindle.
Oh, that's
I'd like to give you this.
Oh, thank you very much.
It looks a bit prehistoric, doesn't it?
Yes,
all those wings on the stem.
Yes,
and in the autumn, the leaves turn brilliant scarlet, and they look marvellous against that wall and the evergreen background.
Evergreen background, yes. And how large does this grow?
Very slow growing. Get up to about 5, maybe 6 feet eventually after many years.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind, thank you.
Isn't this the kind of green carpet you'd always imagined would be your lawn? Well, it's actually a bowling green, which requires a stricter and more intensive maintenance programme. But the same lessons do apply to domestic lawns. As Jim and Dave Bartlett have learnt from experience, they're the greenkeepers, and twins in case you're wondering, for the Tilmanstone Welfare Bowling Green. They've already been hard at work, brushing off the moisture, feeding and mowing in readiness for the start of the bowling season at the end of this month. They've also been working on their own lawns at home in the nearby village of Eyethorne. Dave, I'm most envious of your lawn here. I'm trying to knock mine into shape at home. You must have put in a lot of hours.
Yes, I do quite a bit every week and throughout the year. Of course, I've been retired now some 8 years at early retirement from the colliery, which I did 42 years service there. Gosh. So I've got quite a bit of time to do things.
Right. Now, people have already been getting their mowing machines out this year. Now, it's important, isn't it, to start early?
Yes, I started at the beginning of March when the weather was mild and cut my green for the cut my lawns for the first time, and the way you see it is looking quite well at the moment.
And of course, you know, your mowing machine is a really important tool, isn't it?
Yes, you've got to look after that. And the first thing I do is to sharpen the blades up with a carbon, and then set the blades and get a true cut on it.
Then what about the cut, the height of the cut?
Yeah, the height of the cut is, this part of the time of the year, you do bring it up a bit. Somewhere about 3/4 an inch or an inch. Not much lower than that. But as April comes, then you can go a bit lower.
And how often would you advise to cut?
Well, it all depends on the weather. If it's raining and, it's mild, you could cut once a week, or once a fortnight if it's a bit chillier.
Now, there's always a discussion about whether or not you should leave the clippings on the lawn or whether you should collect them.
Well, I don't believe in that method, but I know a lot of people do, but I put my clippings in the compost, and of course that all helps on the garden as well, for getting better results in vegetables, etc.
Dave, you've got a whole range of other machines here as well for mowing. Is it necessary to have those?
Yes, well, because at the beginning of the season, through the winter, your grass grows quite long, and I always use, if it's long, the fly mow, the rotary fly mow, which is a good thing to cut down so much of the grass.
Yeah,
and then
so if people haven't got out onto their lawns yet, that's the thing to use?
That's the thing to use, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And what else have you got here?
I've got a scarifier, which I use shortly. I'm going to use that to get some of the thatch and moss out. And then I've got the strimmer which go around the edges, or somewhere where the mower won't go, and keep a good lawn.
Right, those scarifiers are marvellous machines, aren't they? It's incredible what they pull out.
They pick out a lot of thatch and then the moss as well, and saves a lot of raking as well, going with an ordinary rake, and this does the work for it.
And why should you pull all that dead
to aerate
vegetation out?
The ground and to get a good sward on the grass.
Now, Jim, there are various enemies along the road to creating the perfect lawn. One is moss and the other weeds. How do you deal with moss, first of all?
Well, moss, all I use is a sulphate of ammonia, a sulphate of iron, and just sprinkle it on the moss, like that, and then water it in after a day. Or you can get the sulphate of iron and put 2 ampoules in 2 gallons of water and water it on with a watering can.
And that does work, does it?
That does work, yes. That soon kills the moss off, yes.
Right, now what about weeds? I know they're the real bane of people's lives, particularly dandelions.
That's correct, yes. Well, weeds, we can use one of these with 3 measures in a gallon of water and spray it on with a sprayer.
That's
and
just
that would kill weeds, yes.
That's just a standard spray,
That's
garden
right.
spray.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now, what if you're against sprays? Do you really have to get out there and pull
well,
them out by
you
hand?
have to have a nice, sharp knife and get down and hook them out, and you get them out that way, yes.
Now, what about feeding your lawn? Is that important to give it a good boost?
Oh yes, you must feed lawns quite often. 6 or 7 weeks you must feed lawns through the summer months. And I use Grow More, and you just sprinkle the Grow More on the ground like that and let the rain water it in.
Right, you said every 6 or 7 weeks you should do that.
Well, yes. To get a good lawn you should keep giving it a little bit of boost, yes.
And what about in the autumn, towards the end of the season?
Well, autumn, yes, you should give it an autumn boost with this feed. Yes.
Right, and there are other kinds of feed. If you don't
there
know
is,
that,
yes.
there's an animal-based one
That's
and there's
right, yes.
plant-based
You
one.
can
That's
use
a
them,
seaweed
yes.
one.
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's been great looking at your lawn. I think you've done remarkably, considering that you've had a drought restriction operating for so long. Now we're going to go over the fence to Tom Wood's garden to see what Matthew Briggs is up to there.
Right, Tom, your fruit trees look excellent. There's no signs of pests and diseases at all. What sort of things do you do to care for them over the winter?
Well, it's a taro wash through the winter.
Right. Right, and what does that do for them?
Well, it cleans them all up, everything.
Right, so it kills overwintering
Moths,
eggs.
everything.
And then what do you do? But about this time of year, anything in particular?
No, nothing in particular, except you get ready for the codling moth and things like that, and put your, if your grease pans, now's the time to put them on.
Right, so this actually gets March moth.
That's right.
But it is possible, isn't it, to put them on a little bit earlier
Oh,
in
yes,
the year?
yes.
About
yeah.
October time
Yes.
too. So do you actually use grease pans, or what do you do?
No, nylon stockings.
Really?
Yeah.
Does your wife know?
Yes, she does, definitely.
Good, good. So do show me what you do.
Right.
So you literally just tie them around there.
I go around there like that.
So that stops any females going up there to lay
right.
eggs. And I guess it would help with the apple blossom weevil as well, because
that's correct.
That will be laying.
And just smear your grease on.
Really?
Yeah.
And so how often do you have to change this?
Oh, this should last a 12 month out anyway.
That's
Can
it.
change it if it gets too many insects and such like on it, and
Right.
it's dry. That's all you've got to do.
It looks like a good job here. And so that acts as a barrier then, and
That's right.
they stick to it, do they?
Yep.
And I suppose you have to make sure that there's no leaves and rubbish gets blown onto
Always
it.
keep it clean.
Yeah. So how often do you check them?
Every month or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way that anything would want to go through there.
I don't like it. I won't get very far, would I?
I'll tell you what, actually, because you don't spray a lot, do you?
No.
I've got something that may help you. This is a codling moth trap. Now, if you hang this in the tree, end of May, June time, when the males are flying in search of the females, you can put in there a compound that smells just like the scent of a female. The male moth comes along intending to mate with it, and in fact what it will do is stick to some sticky paper which you can put inside. So it's a bit of a disappointing end to its life, but that will help control the populations. I've got something else for you too. This compound here, it's called Bacillus thuringiensis, a bit of a complicated name, but what it is a bacteria. Now if you mix that into a solution, spray that where the caterpillars are feeding, on the leaves and doing the damage, they will actually eat that. The bacteria will kill the caterpillars, but the good thing about it is that the bacteria won't harm anything else. It breaks down in the sunshine, and any other insects will be perfectly fine. So that will help keep your trees caterpillar free right throughout the season.
Oh, that's nice to know. Very nice, thank you very much.
For my plant of the week, I've chosen this perennial wallflower. It's called Erysimum Bowles Mauve, and it's usually grown and sold in a pot like this plant here. It's named after a famous gardener, the late E.A. Bowles. Although curiously, those people who knew the man said that this plant never grew in his garden. Be as it may, I'm sure he would have approved of this plant. For value for money, it'd be hard to find a better plant. It's reasonably hardy, it's compact and bushy, grey-green, evergreen foliage. And then the flowers, well, it's at its best in late spring, but there's hardly a month when there isn't a flower showing. And that's because all these spikes expand and flower as they expand, these violet flowers. I've got flowers even in December on my plants in my garden in Hampshire. Its only drawback is it isn't long-lived, which is common to a lot of wallflowers. It grows best hard in gritty, well-drained, sunny site. Put it in a fertile soil and it waxes fat and breaks apart, and it will go out in a very cold winter. So after 5 or 6 years, prepared to lose the plant. But if you're wise, you'll have taken cuttings in the summer, and it roots easily. In fact, my local butcher, I gave him cuttings some 3 years ago. 2 years after, he had stock of some 200 nice fat plants. And nowadays, when people go up to buy the Sunday joint, if they're lucky, they get a wallflower as well.
This wonderful sea of statice has all been grown here at a workshop in Barfeston by a team of people, including some with learning difficulties. And the workshop's run by an organisation called L'Arche, and they're very keen to encourage people to get into gardening. Now, Helen, why gardening?
Well, gardening is a very good work to do because we can start with the seed, see the plants grow and see the finished product. We do a lot of dried flowers arrangements, everlasting flowers, and that's very good work to do in the winter when the weather's too bad to work outside. And also the arrangements we make in baskets we can sell in local shops.
That's great, and that obviously helps your organisation.
Yeah.
Right, now, Geraldine, you've been working away here very busily. Lovely arrangement. Did you actually help to pick these flowers in the summer?
Some of them I did, yes.
And what have you got here? This is a lovely quaking grass, isn't it?
It is a beautiful quaking grass, and this is moses, and
that's the helichrysum there as well, and lots of this lovely statice.
That's right.
Now, if you want to find out how best to grow these from seed, Matthew's outside giving some advice on potting compost.
So Janet, you've been looking for substitutes for peat in your compost, is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Matthew. Every year we grow a lot of seeds, and we've been using peat-based compost, and we want to switch to something that's not using up peat resources.
Well, what's been introduced onto the market now is this, and it's based on the fibre from coconut husks. And you can see quite happily the fibres within there. But for seed sowing, this is rather too thick and fibrous, in fact.
Yes.
So what you need to do is just get it and sieve it through there. Now, the compost itself is fairly free-draining, doesn't need a lot of nutrient in it because it's only growing the seeds for a short time. The plants won't be in there for very long. But what's left, you can save that and use it as potting compost because the demands aren't so great. So if you just keep on sieving it in, and if you have very small seeds, for example like poppies, you make it outside the tray, add a little bit of perlite just to make sure it improves the drainage, and then mix it up well, and then tip everything in. So we'll finish that off, and all you need to do, in fact, is you can use the base of it and just cut off the excess, like so. There we are, that'll be ready for the next stage of sowing.
Can I just ask you about these trays? Are these reusable?
They most certainly are, yes, but hygiene, as you know, is always really important in the garden, so when you use them each year, make sure that they're scrubbed thoroughly.
Yeah.
Right, the next thing that we can help you with is a little bit of general compost that you can make yourself. And if you're going to use it for seed sowing, then you in fact actually avoid some of the nutrients that are in here. So here we are, I've written it all out for you under the grand title of homemade compost. And all that you'll need for this is 2 buckets of sterile soil. Now you can sterilise soil in the pressure cooker. We were talking earlier on about washing things. Make sure you wash it afterwards. 2 buckets of leaf mould. Do you have access to
We do, yes, we keep our leaves every year.
Good, good. A bucket of sand or perlite. Now that will help with the drainage,
yes.
Okay, because you want good drainage in those. And then with the addition of seaweed meal, bone meal,
yes.
and calcified seaweed, that will give the extra nutrients if you're using it as a potting compost. If you mix all that together, make sure it's really well turned in.
Yes.
So that's your recipe, and it is a bit complicated, I must admit. Unfortunately in life, there's always an easier way of doing things.
Good.
And here's one. Make a good general compost out of this. Now this is very finely ground forest bark.
And could we buy that, or where would we get it?
Yes, very easily. You can buy that very easily. I hope you agree with me, it looks almost edible.
It does.
Right.
Well.
So if you mix a bucket full of that with a bucket full of this compost. Now this is actually compost made from household waste. So it's been standing in the compost heap in the garden. But added to that was newspaper. And it's actually been through worms, so it's nice and fine. And the worms were brandling worms rather than the standard garden worms that you would imagine. And these can be bought, in fact, from a fishing shop. So it's like a bucket full of that, a bucket full of this. And as a general compost, you can then just mix it all in.
Just talking about compost there, one of the things we find that we get a bit confused about in the garden is we've got our potting compost and our seed compost, and then the compost that we make. And we've often said we could do with 2 different names because we're actually talking about 2 different things, aren't we?
That's right, that's the good old English language for you.
Yes.
So if you can think of a word, we'll have it.
Right, we'll come back to you then.
There's something else that you can use, Janet, which is really, really useful. And these are compost modules. Now you have a small machine which you can make them with, and in fact what it is just a block of compost which you can buy, blocking compost. Now these small ones here, you can see with the little hollow in the top, are for seed sowing, and these here with the rectangular section taken out, actually have smaller ones that can fit in, very, very tiny, as you can see.
Yeah.
Now the seed is sown into there, and
Uh-huh.
to save you actually pricking the plants out, moving them from one tray to another, you just slot that in like so. So as soon as the roots have reached the outside of the smaller section, they can then go into the bigger one.
Yes, that would save us a lot of work here. We spend a lot of time pricking out because we've got so many seeds.
You get more
to go
healthy
out.
plants because
Yeah.
they've got their own space to grow in, so they get their light,
Yeah.
they get their nutrients, and there's fewer problems with disease. So now you've got recipes for seed compost and potting compost and modules. I really ought to ask you, what do you grow here?
Right, good question. The main thing that we grow here are everlasting flowers, which we dry, and over the winter we make them up into flower arrangements in baskets, and we sell them.
Excellent selection of shrubs in this border, Roy.
That's right, and especially this one, Hebe rachiensis from New Zealand. That's one of the hardiest, and you always tell it by that pale apple green colour of the leaves.
It's a lovely dense plant though, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And not too high in its growth.
It doesn't flower all that freely. You can see just a few spikes there from last year, but you don't really worry when you've got a plant like that, do you? It's such a good effect, and you can see that from quite a distance.
Makes a bold statement and keeps the weeds down.
And quite fast growing. That plant is about 8-9 years old. Well, 3 plants there, of course, making the big hummock. And here's something that I think probably seemed a good idea at the time, but...
yeah, it's gone a little bit wild, It's a good plant, though, for ground cover, and a very reliable one, isn't it? It's one you can plant almost anywhere. And this is Vinca major variegata.
Sometimes called elegantissima, isn't it?
That's right.
See how the flowers come on the young growths, the spring growths, and then you get those extension growths, which in the wrong place do the damage. That's better in a hedgerow. You often see it coming out of old cottage gardens, don't you, through the hedge, or in woodland.
But it's grown way up into that phlomis, up into the back there. It really has just gone wild.
Yeah, it's swamping everything.
Oh, look at this here as well, yeah.
Xanthellina virens.
Yeah. Now that's well grown out, hasn't it? It really has grown out. Tend to collapse, don't they, when they've got big and bushy like that?
That's right. The Mediterranean shrub and southern Europe, and it needs a lot of sun. It's obviously happy here. It's really flowered well despite the clay soil. But as you say, it gets old very quickly. That's 5-6 years old, I should think, there.
Cuttings though, Roy, that's the answer, isn't it?
There's a lot of cuttings on there. If she takes them this summer, establishes them, then she can get rid of these plants, get them out and start again.
It's always useful with plants like this, because by taking cutting material all the time, you keep vigorous young growth.
Sure, yeah, and put the nurseryman out of business.
Well, yeah, true.
Yeah, a good dogwood there.
Yeah, that is nice. As the wood's much older, it's lost a lot of its nice colour.
That's right.
All the people we've met today haven't just got a love of gardening in common. They're also all members of the Aythorne Community Garden Club. And one of the benefits of belonging to the club is access to this wonderful Aladdin's Cave of a gardening shop. Now, Dennis White, you're the chairman of this club. Lots of garden clubs have special offers to their members, but this shop is really something quite special, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's special to us, and we do try to give our members the best benefit of what's on the market. We buy in at trade price, and we only add on 7%, which goes into the stock of the building, and the other 25% is passed on to our members, which is 25% less than the normal recommended retail price.
So you must get people rushing from far and wide to become members.
Yes, we've got a good membership. We're approaching 300 now, and as the gardening season is getting into full swing, no doubt we shall increase that membership.
How did all this come about? What made you actually want to set up a shop like this?
The gardening club was originally the Tilmanston Colliery Gardening Club, and we was formed in 1977, and we remained at the colliery until the colliery closed.
And then you moved here because you had to find a new site.
Exactly. That created quite a problem because we had a vast stock and needed quite an area of room, and to rent anywhere was becoming, well, out of the question. We just couldn't afford that. And eventually we made contact with the parochial church council, who was encouraging the society to move together, and with the erection of the resource centre, and they agreed to rent us this piece of ground if we could raise the revenue to erect the building, which we've done.
So it really is your own. And just tell me, what do you think makes mine workers so keen on gardening? Because you've still got a lot of members that came from the colliery, haven't you?
That's true. I think mine workers were competitive by nature, and plus also I think they enjoyed the benefits of being out in the fresh air after 8 or 9 hours underground. Always a benefit.
Well, and they have got a great place to come and buy these things. Dennis, thank you very much for welcoming all of our team here to meet your gardeners today. It's been most enjoyable.
Our pleasure.
Well, we must leave the Garden of England now and make for gardens in North Wales. Next week's programme comes from Llandudno. Again. For the last programme in this spring series of Garden Club, we've come to North Wales to meet gardeners around Llandudno. It's an area with a variety of microclimates and a wide range of soil types, from acid to very alkaline, like those beneath this famous limestone outcrop, Great Orme. Great Orme is also well known for a new form of hebe that was discovered here a few years ago. The evergreen shrub has deep pink flowers. Well, today the Garden Club team will be advising one gardener on what to plant in his brand new garden. And Matthew Biggs has his pruning knife out again, and Roy Lancaster is over there in Penmaen Mawr.
This is David Chandler's garden. It's situated on a wild, windy hillside, 300 feet above the sea. And it's full of good things, some rare, some usual, and some plants like this one. This is Euphorbia mercenites. It's an evergreen perennial. It's one of the funny things about plants and gardening. Here's a plant which in the wild grows on hot, baked hillsides in Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. Yet here it is, perfectly happy in North Wales. It's fairly hardy throughout Britain, as long as you give it full sun, the driest place you have, and good drainage, of course. Now, we heard Rebecca talking earlier about hebe, Great Orme. Well, there are a whole range of hebes of all kinds, some tender, some hardy. And David's planted behind there a hedge, a low hedge of hebe Amy. And that's not one of the hardiest kinds. It's looking perfectly hardy there, quite happy, very distinct in those bronze-purple young growths and the violet flowers. David's been wrestling with this garden for the last 7 years. And if I can chance a pun, it's been an uphill task. Because if you're thinking that this is all the garden he has, then think again. This is only a part of it. Because above me on this hillside is terrace upon terrace of garden neglected for years and slowly being brought round. Morning, David.
Morning.
So visiting the garden like this, my first time, it's easy to get the impression that it's a cold garden, but I've looked at some of the plants, obviously not.
No. It's pretty sheltered here. We don't get many frosts, you know, it just goes straight downhill.
What about the soil? How does it compare with the limestone of the Great Orme?
It's well drained, but it's 6, so it's acid, slightly
below,
acid, yeah.
Below neutral, then?
Yeah.
So you've got Viola Irish Molly, that's a pretty flower, isn't it?
It's a gorgeous thing, but it doesn't live that long. You've got to take cuttings of it in the autumn, just to make sure you've got it over the winter.
Are you saying that it's not a hardy plant? Can you overwinter it?
Oh, you can do, but it's not a long-lived plant. It's too near a pansy, really.
And these gold-laced polyanthus, now, do you find those easy to grow?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they seed about, and you pick out the best patterns on them and split them up.
So they don't come true from seed? You don't get the same...
They do, but the patterns vary slightly, you know, so you pick out the best lacing.
And I think I see a plant over there which is waving a petal at me. I think that's one of my own collections, isn't it?
That's marvellous Veronica, yeah. That's a beauty, that is. Lovely blue.
How did you get hold of that?
Oh, a friend gave it to me. Yeah.
That's what gardening's all about. That came from the Caucasus Mountains.
Yeah, I really like
Georgia.
that. Mm.
Now, this garden, I believe, was badly neglected. I mean, what was it like when you found it?
Just brambles, jungle of brambles, overgrown shrubs and overgrown rhododendrons and, you know, things like that.
It's more of a jungle, David.
You can see what I mean.
Rhododendron ponticles now,
yeah,
isn't it?
bramble, birch. I do about a week every so often and slash and burn.
Julian task you still have ahead of you. You've got a lot of Viburnum tenus planted around. Very good coastal shrub, of course.
That's a smashing one, that one. Which one is that?
That's a glossy leaf, very shining leaf, and larger flowers than the typical kind. So
Yeah.
that's going to be variety lucida. Lucida means shining, and that really is just what that, almost a lacquered surface to it, isn't it?
It's a better variety than the other one. I haven't
It goes
seen
well with the
before.
Irish too, that ungricularis.
Oh yes, it loves it hot and dry. That really does.
Very happy. Do you pluck the buds, the spears?
No.
You can
Just
do
leave
that.
it.
They'll come away quite nicely when they're in tight bud, and you take them indoors and they'll open in their warmth. Very
Ah.
attractive, of course.
I like it in the garden.
Yeah. Well, the whole range of things here.
Yeah, this is one of the few shady spots in the garden that's fairly damp and quite deep soil.
Still gets the wind in though, doesn't
Oh
it?
yes, it gets wind.
Nevertheless, quite an interesting collection of plants. You've got Pachyphragma macrophyllum there.
Yeah.
Pity about the name. It's a damn good plant, wasn't it, that?
Oh, it is. The leaves are good afterwards, and it brightens. It really brightens up a cold spot. Cool
Very
spot.
hardy.
Yeah.
Herbaceous perennial.
Yeah.
From the Caucasus. And what's this lovely two-tone flower here?
Oh, Mertensia virginica. Yeah, and that's another good one. It dies down after flowering, so something else comes up, takes its place.
That's a favourite group of plants of mine, the Arisemas. Very curious, more bizarre
Yeah.
than beautiful, aren't they?
The leaves are quite good afterwards, though. You know, striped stem.
And what's the white violet at the back then?
That's Viola, a double form Viola odorata.
I can't say I've ever seen that one, but a double white-flowered
Yeah.
sweet violet.
I saw it in the nursery, so I snapped it up quick because
I'm not surprised.
you don't see them about very
A
often.
lot of plants in this garden you've snapped up quick there,
Yeah,
don't
you
they?
need to, and all, yeah.
And you've got a heck of a job still to do,
Oh, yeah.
and all this clearing, but from what I've seen, it's a very brief tour.
Yeah.
You must be getting a tremendous lot of pleasure out of it.
Oh, it's great fun, yeah.
So I'm here with Joan in her garden in Ross-on-Sea, and as we walk down through the garden, seen many plants, but this one for me really takes the biscuit.
Yeah, well, that's Cornus controversa variegator. My husband calls it the pagoda tree because of the shape. It is a grafted tree, and we get problems because we get suckers which have to be cut off.
Oh yeah, right, that's a common problem.
Very beautiful.
Do you know, I love this tree. When the first time I saw it, I couldn't believe it because you've got these beautiful branches all on the single planes and it builds itself up
Yes.
in tiers. So look, I'm being distracted. Let's go down and have a look in the fruit garden where you've got some problems.
Yes, so I've got a cherry I'd like you to look at.
Right.
This cherry, we're never quite sure how to prune it, and it's getting to be a bit of a jumble.
Now, what kind of cherry is
It's
this?
a morella cherry.
So this is one of the acid cherries. Now, two good things about these. One is that they're self-pollinating, so they can be grown on their own.
Yes.
The other thing is that they'll thrive quite happily on a north-facing wall. But the fruit you get from them, it's really gorgeous.
Yes.
What do you use it for?
Well, we make jam and pies, of course. But we're very fond of black cherry jam.
Right. So there's two main things, actually, Joan, that you have to remember with these. One is that cherries fruit on wood made the previous year,
Yes.
like growths like this, so you'll
Yes.
get fruit from there. The other thing is that you have to prune them when they're on the move. You can see the buds are broken, and the sap, therefore, will be moving up the stems. This is because if you don't, they're susceptible to silverleaf and bacterial canker. So you always prune them when they're on the move.
I see, yes.
In the springtime, early summer, not a great deal to do, because what you're trying to do is to bring on new growth. So you want a bush that comprises of some long stems like this to fruit on,
Yes.
and those which will replace them next year. So what you do is something like this, for example, just cut the snag from that, and that will then grow up to fruit next year. Remove that because that's a source of infection. Any snag like that could do with healing quite happily. And now think about where these stems are going to go. Now it's very crowded all round here. So let's, for example, take out this one. Now that one there, cut back to one bud, and any of these weak ones, just take them back to one bud. That will grow out there next year to replace this one.
Yes,
which
I
you'll
see,
remove.
yes.
So once these have fruited in August time, you can take these back to one bud, and then they will grow for the next year.
Yes.
So you're constantly overlapping. So for example, with something like this, where there's two vying for the space, you take that back there just to one bud from the previous growth. You'll get fruit on that this year, and then this will grow to produce fruit next year. And ideally, you would remove those that grow into the wall because they will be shaded by the foliage at the front. So if you keep the plant nice and flat,
Yes.
it gets what sunshine it can. And then these can be trained in. Do you
Yes.
normally use the ties to train in, or have you any other way of doing it?
No, we have these little plastic things. My husband's disabled and he finds it easier to slip those round and twist like that, and then you see it's much simpler for him because he can't use his hands very well.
So when it comes to retraining next year, you can just move them around quite
That's
happily?
right, yes,
That's
yes, you can
great.
take them off and use them again. They last for a long time.
So then just by tidying the tree up like that and leaving the stems about anything between 4 and 6 inches apart, you'll end up with a nice tree which will fruit well and be tidy and easy to maintain.
Well, thank you very much. We're very pleased to have that advice.
Very different garden from Dave Chandler's, we saw on the hillside. This is the garden of John and Joan Bennington. This small piece of front garden is the particular charge of John's. And he's got a very nice combination of plants, especially here Erica, Carnea, Merton and Ruby. Now this is very chalky soil, very different from Dave Chandler's acid soil. This is almost as chalky as you can get it. It's almost 8, pH of 8. And yet that's very happy, as Carneas are, on this chalky soil. A very good rich colour, a dwarf form of the black pine, and a pretty tulip there. That's Praestans, Tulipa praestans fusilier. At the back of the house is a garden of a very different kind. This must be a very special corner, Joan, because there's so many interesting plants in it.
Yes,
All Cuba there.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? I'm very fond of it. We bought it as concolor, but the books don't seem to sort of tie up with that.
Well, concolor just means the same colour on both sides.
Both sides, yes.
That's just a normal green Orcuba japonica, but that is a very distinct one. It's called dentata.
Oh, that's interesting, that.
It's got big teeth, you see, on the ends of the leaves.
Yes,
And rather wavy too.
Very
What
useful
about the
indeed.
Skimmia japonica?
Yes, they're
You-
lovely, aren't they?
Both male and female there. A lot of people don't realise you need the male and the female. If you want berries on the female, and you've planted them next door to each other, you don't have to go, the bees don't have to go that far.
No, it's quite near, isn't it?
And you can see that it's so easy when you compare
Yes.
the two. The male flowers there, many more flowers in the cluster, and the yellow anthers where the pollen is produced. And then these females, only a few flowers in the cluster, no pollen, no anthers there, just the female parts. And the clematis on the wall there, that's Amandi.
Yes, yes, we're very fond of that, although it's so rampant. We keep it in order, of course.
Chinaman, evergreen.
Yes, how
But
lovely.
I like the way you've trained it into that two-cream, that grey leaf two-cream. It's
Yes.
a big plant.
It is, isn't it? It's very old, actually. It gets cut down quite a bit. But I'm very fond of it because it has lovely blue flowers later on in the spring.
Right.
And it's quite useful for colour.
Yes. And you've got other interesting plants at the back of the garden, haven't you?
Oh, yes, yes.
Quite a different situation here, Joan, to the front there. Is this a natural bank?
No, this was built from the slope in the garden. It's rock underneath, so it was very difficult. But
Limestone.
Limestone, very limestone. So we've tried to make it so that it's easy to get at and plenty of shelter because it is a very windy area.
Lots of individual beds packed with plants of all kinds.
Yes, this is the grey and pink bed that we like to try and keep into those colours.
You say grey and pink, but to me, the garden has a very golden appearance, and lots of golds and yellows everywhere.
Yes, I think this time of the year you get seasons, don't you, of different colours, and this is definitely the yellow week.
And then a curious plant, that's from Australia, isn't it? That Grevillea,
Oh,
Rosmarinifolia.
yes, yes. Now then, that came from a garden centre down south, and I was told it wouldn't grow up here, it was too cold, and we're very surprised to find that it has. So it always goes to show that really one should have a try.
Yeah.
I think one really should. After 3 times, give it up, but that's survived.
Very pretty flowers, aren't they? Little red
Yes, lovely, isn't
tail-like
it?
flowers.
Yes. Flowers twice, which is quite interesting.
How long have you been gardening here?